So good morning, everyone. I hope everyone is well. Madam Coordinator, do we appear to have quorum before we do the roll call for us to start?
Yes, you do, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Then let's begin. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Merci à tous qui se joignent à nous aujourd'hui. First Audit Committee meeting conducted via virtual means through Zoom. Appreciate those of you who are joining us here on Zoom and on YouTube. Just a reminder to keep your microphones muted until I call on you to speak. If at any point you members or council audit committee members or council members want to speak or to address, you should use the raise hand function on Zoom, which I think we're all starting to get used to. You'll find it in the Zoom controls at the bottom of your Zoom window near the audio controls. Committee coordinator and I will be watching for those cues on the monitors. The usual 5-minute speaking limit will apply to everyone. Up to now, we have no public delegations signed up for the agenda item. Members of the public are always welcome to provide written comments, which will always be circulated to members of council, as this item will rise to council. I remind you that this meeting is being live streamed and will be archived on YouTube. Before we proceed, do a quick roll call for all members. Councillor El Shantiri.
Present.
Councillor DeRuse.
Here.
Councillor Hubley.
Here.
Councillor Kavanagh.
Here.
And Vice Chair Meehan.
I'm here.
Thank you. We will not do a consent agenda. There's only one item and it's held for presentation and for questions. Do we have any declarations of interest? Hearing none. Confirmation of minutes. There are 2 minutes. We have regular minutes, 7 from the open session of the meeting of November 26th, an eternity ago, I would say. Are those minutes confirmed?
Confirm.
Hearing no dissent. Anybody object to confirming those minutes? Hearing none. Those minutes are carried. We also have confidential minutes from the closed session of the meeting of November 26th. They were circulated to members separately. Are those minutes confirmed?
Confirmed.
Confirmed.
Any dissents on that? Hearing none. Thank you. Those minutes are confirmed. The Vice Chair has a motion. We are at agenda item number 1, the Office of the Auditor General report on audit follow-ups and detailed audit follow-up reports. The Vice Chair has a motion to add the documentation to the agenda. Vice Chair, could you present the motion, please?
Thank you, Chair. I believe it is on your screen right now. I'm trying to, am I going to be followed along or should I pull it up here on my desktop? Sorry.
If you wish, I could read it on your behalf.
I'm just gonna.
You think you got it?
Okay. Okay. You just, whoever's going to follow, I think they'll follow along with me. Thank you so much, Chair. So this is whereas the supporting documentation for item 1 titled Office of the Auditor General report on audit follow-ups and detailed audit follow-up reports was not circulated with the agenda package. Therefore, be it resolved that the Audit Committee approve the addition of these documents for consideration by the committee at today's meeting pursuant to section 89.3 of the procedure bylaw, being bylaw number 2019-8. Okay.
Is that motion approved?
Okay.
Any dissents? Hearing none, that motion is carried. Thank you. There will be a presentation by the Auditor General and I believe the Deputy Auditor Generals, as is usually Auditor General Hughes, Deputy Auditor General Brennan, and Minor. Thank you all for being here. Before the presentation, I just want to advise that I'll be stopping and at each segment of the report of the presentation and providing opportunity for members to ask questions on each individual segment of the report as they relate to the specific audit follow-ups, and then we'll move on to the next. That will allow management or staff members that are joining us who are here on a specific item to go on and do their work. There will certainly be an opportunity at the end of these 6 segments for motions or general feedback on the performance of implementing recommendations. I believe the Vice Chair will have a motion to that effect that we could discuss at that time. And so if there are no questions or concerns or comments.
There's one question,
Yes.
Mr. Chair. Are you going, as follow, we receive it in like in the email from the coordinator, like are you going to start with the 2015 audit of ethic and then let the second item audit of the byword? Is that the order you're going to follow?
That would be to the Auditor General has prepared his presentation, and so
I see the thumbs up and he's in agreement. Okay, I just want to make sure because anyway, we need to open the second screen. That's why.
noted,
Okay.
noted. And I will turn it over to the Auditor General for his presentation.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Bonjour les membres de la Commission de vérification. Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the Audit Committee. Next slide, please. Just waiting for the slides to show up. That's the report.
We are working on that, Mr. Auditor General.
Yep.
Give us a moment, please. There you go. I think we're good.
No, that's the report itself, not the slides.
Okay. Carol, do you have the report? Okay, we're going to pull that up. Apologies.
The report's very interesting, and I encourage anyone that is listening to read the report. But certainly the slides take us through each of the
slides tell a story in more summary terms. Yes, and I will advise those listening that the report I think will be uploaded to the drive and to ottawa.ca. I will look to my colleagues to let me know perhaps when members of the public can expect that report to be uploaded, and we'll
the reports themselves will be uploaded by our office later on in the committee meeting. That's
thank
it.
you.
There's
Thank
our,
you.
yep.
I think your presentation is up. Go
Perfect.
ahead.
Next slide, please. So, Monsieur le Président, ce sont des employés de le Bureau de vérificateur général. These are the staff of the Office of the Auditor General. Aujourd'hui, je suis ici avec mes vérificateurs généraux adjoints. I'm here today with my Deputy Auditor Generals, Ms. Sonia Brennan and Mr. Ed Miner, and they will provide the details on our follow-up reports to the audit. Next page, please. And the next page, please. Comme le comité sait, on a 4 étapes dans le processus de vérification. Les 4 étapes sont planification, le travail sur le terrain, établissement du rapport et finalement le suivi. Nous sommes ici pour la dernière phase. There are 4 processes in the audit process. There are 4 stages in the audit process. They are the planning phase, the fieldwork phase where we actually go out and do our work as auditors, the reporting phase where we write up the results of our audit, and then the follow-up phase where we go back in 2 to 3 years later and we report on management's implementation of the recommendations. And we are here today for this last phase. The next page, please. So throughout the audit and the follow-up phase, we begin by a kickoff with management. Throughout our work, we provide heads up and debrief to the staff throughout. And then upon completion of our work, whether it's the audit or the follow-up, we debrief our findings to management. We prepare a draft report. There's a period of fact review, and then we also allow management to provide their comments to our recommendations. Next slide, please. So the Office of the Auditor General follows best practices, and they come from two sources, the Institute of Internal Auditors, as well as the City of Ottawa audit standards. And if we go to the next slide, I'd like to draw the committee's attention to this particular line. The Chief Audit Executive must establish a follow-up process to monitor and ensure that management actions have been effectively implemented. And that's from the both the standards for the Institute of Internal Audit and the City of Ottawa audit standards. Next page, please. So just to confirm, we conduct follow-ups on all audits. It's an international audit best practice. We usually wait about 2 to 3 years after an audit report is completed to give management time to complete the corrective action that we've identified. I should point out that we will also delay the start of follow-ups at the request of management if they've encountered problems, perhaps a reorg, for example, and they wish to delay the follow-up. So our job when we do our follow-ups is to ensure that the required measures that management promised to council are implemented. The next slide, please. So audits improve management practices, and the follow-up identifies and recognizes the work that management has done to implement the corrective action to address those issues that we've identified that are impairing efficiency or perhaps maybe uneconomic processes. So our follow-up is an overall evaluation of the progress on the audit, and the details on all of the recommendations are provided in the report. So should any member of the committee or any other member of council wish to discuss anything in particular, we can do so here or afterwards. Next slide, please. Aujourd'hui, Monsieur le Président, nous présentons six suivis. Today we have 6 follow-ups that we will be presenting. It will be the follow-up to the 2015 Audit of Ethics, the follow-up to the 2016 Audit of Byward and Parkdale Markets, the follow-up to the 2017 Audit of Childcare Services, the follow-up to the 2017 Audit of the Management of the Lansdowne Contract, and the follow-up to the 2017 investigation into the Giver 150 playground at Looney's Bay. And finally, the follow-up to the 2017 review of the management of emergency shelter providers and contract management. This is the order that we'll be addressing them in. Next slide, please. Le Bureau de vérificateur général a évalué la mise en œuvre des recommandations dans 5 catégories. Nos suivis a trouvé que depuis la reçue des vérifications en 2015, 2016 et 2017, la direction a achevé 58% des recommandations. We make 5 assessments in our reports. The first and obviously most important one is an assessment that the implementation of the recommendation is complete and the structures and processes are operating as intended and fully implemented in all areas of the city. We also use an assessment of partially complete. That's self-explanatory, as is the other category of not started. We have a category where we are unable to assess, and you'll see a couple of those in today's report, and that's where the particular activity is currently not taking place. It still remains applicable in the city, but we were not able to assess it because circumstances just didn't present this opportunity. And finally, we assess a decision of no longer applicable when the recommendation is either obsolete due to time lapses, new policies, or is taken over by circumstances here at the city. So you'll see from this slide, since receiving these audits in 2015, 2016, and 2017, management has completed 58% of the recommendations that we've identified. Next slide, please. Ce graphique montre les pourcentages de mise en œuvre pour les 5 dernières années. This slide shows the implementation percentages for each of the last 5 years. Overall, there is no doubt management continues to address the issues raised by our audits to improve management practices. But you can see that the overwhelming majority of recommendations, although the overwhelming majority of recommendations were assessed as complete, you can see there is a decline in the proportion of those that are implemented. And I must point out, there's a significant investment in the audit process, both from the resources of the Office of the Auditor General and the time that is invested in the audit process by staff. And if we are making this kind of investment into the audit process and the recommendations aren't being implemented, or more importantly, aren't being implemented on a timely basis, then we're not wringing the maximum benefit from the audit process. And more importantly, when management provides their comments, as you'll see in each of these reports, they indicate a timeline that they think they will be able to implement the recommendations. And when we go up to do our follow-up, it's well past those dates that management has promised that the recommendations would be implemented. I think that looking at all the reports, I think the latest date that management indicated the recommendations would be implemented, I believe was Q2 2019. So when we went in to do our follow-ups, it was well past that, and as you can see, there's an implementation rate of 58% here. So at that point, I will turn over the presentation to the Deputy Auditor Generals, and we'll start with Ms. Brennan. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Good morning. Next slide, please. La vérification en matière d'éthique a été déposée à l'origine en 2015. We performed a follow-up in 2017 and found that 6 of the audit's 8 recommendations were only partially implemented at that time. For example, management had not yet established an ethics function or implemented training for all employees related to ethics and the code of conduct. Because there were a number of important actions that were not complete, we performed another follow-up earlier this year. With a second follow-up, we found that management had completed another 3 recommendations, including formalizing and staffing the ethics function. However, 2 recommendations remain partially implemented. One is related to training and one related to policies referenced within the code of conduct. And a third recommendation is no longer applicable. The first item assessed as not fully complete is employee code of conduct training. Online training was developed and launched in the fall of 2018. Based on the data available, approximately 4% of employees had taken this training up until February of this year. Legal services staff have also delivered in-person training related to ethics and the code of conduct. Records indicate that approximately 1,100 employees have attended these sessions since 2016. As well, content related to ethics and the code of conduct has also been integrated into other training programs. So the number of employees is likely higher that's received some form of training. We have noted in our report that completion of the online module or equivalent in-person training should be mandatory for all city staff to ensure that there's a basic level of understanding of ethics and the code of conduct among all staff. The second item not fully completed is related to 3 policies referenced within the code of conduct that were not reviewed within the prescribed 4-year review cycle. And finally, the item no longer applicable was related to individual contribution agreements, part of the former performance development process with employees, and that process was discontinued after the time of the audit. Thank you. And do you have any questions?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Auditor General. Thank you for that presentation. And we will, as I said at the beginning, we will now go to questions from all members of the committee or council. I see Councillor Menard has joined us, so any member of council can ask questions. And I see Councillor Kavanagh first, please.
Thank you very much for that report. Of course, that concerns me greatly, especially when you said 4% of staff were taking the training. So that's incredible and concerns me greatly when we're talking about very strong issues here. Is this related also to the sexual harassment training as well?
The training that we examined was specifically related to ethics and the code of conduct. I can't say with certainty, but I believe there's other training related to harassment or sexual harassment for managers and employees. But we reinforced in our discussions with management that we feel that the training should be made mandatory for all employees to continue to reinforce the messages related to ethics and the code of conduct, to remind employees and to ensure that new employees receive this important training.
Okay, and that includes counselor staff as well? It includes counselor staff?
I'm not sure what.
Or is it just?
It's
city
all
staff.
City staff. So if counselor staff are considered city employees, city staff, then I would imagine that group would warrant inclusion as well.
Okay, I think the clerk is here. Maybe he can answer on that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, the answer is absolutely yes. They will be included.
Okay. So, so what are we looking for here? Some kind of reminding mechanism or something that, yeah, this really is important because obviously it gets lost in everything else, and yet it's essential to have that code of conduct training, as we know. Is that the direction that's being recommended?
Yes, at the time of our review, Councillor, the training wasn't mandatory for all employees, whereas there's other training that is mandatory for all employees, and we've recommended that that be the case for this training as well.
Okay, and it could be brought in with other training, like it could be, I don't want to say lumped in, but it could be combined when there's other mandatory training. Is that possible? Is that recommended?
Well, the implementation of ensuring that the training is delivered is really up to management. We've left that up to them. There's obviously in-person training is not likely feasible at the moment, but online training certainly is. I know some of the challenges they've had are with respect to a number of employees that may or may not have network access. So I'd perhaps Mr. O'Connor, Mr. White have some comments in that regard.
The chair, with respect to the last comment, the training that has been developed on multiple platforms, and so it is available for networked and non-networked employees. That said, and by virtue of some of the changes we've had to institute as a result of COVID, I understand all employees now are networked and have access to that online training. That said, that the online learning component is really just but one kind of facet of our approach to strengthening the ethical culture in the organization. And that goes through the onboarding training for new employees. It goes into the training for new supervisors and the training for people taking management positions. So as they say, right now, the in-person training has had to kind of be scaled back for obvious reasons. But that's also been a critical component of incorporating that kind of in-person instruction into just regular meetings of staff. So our effort really is to reinforce the need to have those kinds of ethical discussions and raise the profile of those ethical discussions kind of in the day-to-day business of the city.
Thank you. Ms. Brennan, how do we compare with other major cities? Are other major cities doing this that we know of?
Councillor, very good question. Our follow-up work was primarily to verify management's actions. We didn't benchmark the city's training with other cities. So I can't answer that question.
Okay. I would be curious to know because it seems like we have a long way to go, and I wonder if there's any good examples out there that we can compare ourselves to and work towards. Anyway, I appreciate that there's been an audit on this, and I think that the public expect us to have high standards, and it's good to remind us of our high standards, and I think that training is essential. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Kavanagh, and I was remiss in not advising that some questions go to the Office of the Auditor General, some questions go to staff that are better placed to answer those questions. And on this file, I believe it is Mr. O'Connor and Mr. White. For other segments, I'll be identifying which staff are present that can answer those types of questions like Councillor Kavanagh just asked. So I have Councillor Vice Chair Meehan up next, please.
Thank you, Chair. Just generally speaking, how long does it take to be trained, the ethics training? How long? Is it several hours? Is it a day? I guess this question goes to staff.
Mr. Chair, the training is actually relatively, it's an online module that is just kind of an introduction to ethics and the code of conduct. I think it, depending on how fast someone moves through it, it could probably be done in a half an hour to an hour.
Half an hour to an hour. Okay, but this is a follow-up report to an audit 3 to 5 years that was undertaken 3 to 5 years ago. So I guess I'm asking, with a 4% training rate that we've seen in that time period, there has to be something more at play here besides maybe not having access to the technology. Help me understand this.
Mr. Chair, part of it is simply the ability we have to track. Part of it is that the introduction to the code and ethics is, as you say, in some measure voluntary. Part of it is that it's just one component of the overall kind of ethics code of conduct work plan that we have, which is really aimed at as I say, increasing the discussion of ethics in the code and broadening the understanding of it.
Is it important though? Would you say it's important? Part of this component is important.
You mean the online training module?
Yeah.
It's important particularly for new employees that haven't been exposed to the code of conduct in the past. As I say, it's an introduction to ethics and the code of conduct. The code of conduct in its current form has been around for almost 10 years now. And so it may well be that the familiarity with the code, which can come either from training from myself and people in my office, from managers, from supervisors. Our aim is really not to have that focus in our own office, is to kind of disperse it throughout the organization and have managers, supervisors, directors, whoever reinforcing those messages.
Well, with all due respect, if this is important, we've only had 4% of the employees do it. And it only takes maybe half an hour to an hour. I can't see why. I don't know what kind of explanation would sit well with me that why this hasn't been done. So is there some feet dragging involved here? It doesn't seem, we haven't imparted with the employees that this is an important part of their introduction to the workplace. I think we've got to give a better signal that this is important and just tell people they've got a deadline to do it.
And Mr. Chair, I understand that that is precisely what is being put in place.
When you say it's being put in place, Mr. White, what does that mean? This audit was done back in 2017. It should have been put in place the day that the Auditor General recommended that this be done.
Mindful that the module itself wasn't ready until probably late in 2018, simply because that's still, I'm still making my point. It's just way too long. So I'll leave it there. I think I've made my point. This takes way too long. And this goes to the heart of the motion that I'll be introducing today. So thank you, Mr. White.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Councillor Menard.
Thanks very much, Chair, and thanks for the report today. Echo some of my colleagues' comments that have been discussed here today. I believe I'm reading the right report. The report's been posted now, correct, on the shared drive? We've seen it. I think I'm reading the right. Okay, Chair, you were on mute, but I think you said yes.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, great. So I'm reading the right thing here. I just want to make sure I wasn't reading the old report here. So I just wanted to raise a few issues that I'm seeing with regard to the Lansdowne contract and the follow-up of the 2017 audit of the management of the Lansdowne contract. In there are a number of
Councillor Menard, the Lansdowne, yes. What I said at the beginning was that we would stop at every segment for questions. Sorry. And the Lansdowne, the next one up is markets, then childcare, and then Lansdowne. If you could hold your questions on that until that time, I would appreciate it.
I'll try. I have a meeting at 10:30 I got to go to, so I don't actually think I can stay till then, unfortunately. But I would really like to get questions in around it. I don't know if there's discussion, Chair, for me to ask them now. It's the only questions I have are on that one contract.
I appreciate that. The presentation hasn't been made yet by the Auditor General. You could submit your questions in written form, and I am certain to management or the Office of the Auditor General, I'm sure they will respond.
Okay, I guess I'll wait. I'll try to cancel my meeting and see if I can wait. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions from members on the ethics portion of the presentation? Councillor El-Shantiri, did you know?
No, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, I had a question.
You're on mute, Sean.
Got it. Sorry. Thank you. With respect to the ethics and to the comment by Mr. White, and thank you for your response, and thank you to the Vice Chair for her comments. You know, I have received follow-ups when I have not completed a compulsory training module. I imagine that this module is not a compulsory training module. Ethics are important, and perhaps it should be. We've spent time on the fraud and waste hotline, and it's referred to in that module. It's called Ethics, the Code in You, and it deals with code of conduct, ethics training. I think it's very important. And as was said, we see a lot of employees who've not received that training. And I would like to see a plan. Perhaps it is a compulsory training, and that follow-up that the clerk's office does so well when employees don't complete a compulsory training module. I'd like to see a plan to make sure that more employees are aware of this and are exposed to this. I don't know if anyone has a comment on that, or we could move on to the next portion of the presentation. Mr. O'Connor or Mr. White, any comment?
Mr. Chair, it's Steve Kanakis. No, the training is going to be made mandatory in the next, well, it's going to be implemented now as mandatory training as part of all our other mandatory training. We have a lot of mandatory training that's going to be added to the catalog of mandatory training, and all employees will have to take it.
Thank you, Mr. Kanellakis. Seeing no other questions, I will turn it back over to the Office of the Auditor General for the next portion of their presentation. I believe it's the markets.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Nous avons fait le suivi de 10 recommandations exprimées dans la vérification de 2016. We followed up on the 10 recommendations made in the audit, which was conducted in 2016. 4 of the 10 recommendations were assessed as complete, 5 were partially complete, and 1 was not started. Since the time of our report, the markets management section of the city was operational for 13 months, and then it was transitioned to a municipal services corporation in January 2018. So in considering this, the applicable recommendations were reviewed for the 13-month interim period, as some of the underlying issues were considered high risk, for example, cash handling controls. Most of these recommendations that are partially complete or not started relate to practices that no longer exist because of the change to Municipal Services Corporation. The 5 partially complete recommendations relate to, and the first part is relevant to the new, and then there were several items where the processes no longer exist, such as cash handling, approval of overtime, and issues related to cost sharing plans with the business improvement area. There are a few items in our report I'd like to highlight. The items that are related to processes that no longer exist, that information is in the report and it's available for your information. So the items that are worth highlighting today are, firstly, we had recommended in our report that if the city moves forward with the MSC, which it did, that strategic and operational objectives and the corresponding performance indicators or performance measurements, that those be developed with council's approved vision to ensure that there was appropriate information and governance afforded to the city and the members that oversee the Municipal Services Corporation. We reviewed the strategic plan developed by the MSC, as well as the annual reports. The most current one that we had at that time was June 2019. We found that the information to show how performance compared to plan for all goals could be improved. For example, the report presented at the annual meeting of members in June 2019 included financial information and facts and figures such as number of outdoor vendors, average daily stand rentals, and so forth. However, these facts and figures were not reported against either targets or forecasts or compared to prior year results. So it didn't give any basis in order to really understand the performance. Was it improving? Was certain areas maybe trending in a concerning direction? But that information just wasn't there for people to really have that understanding. In terms of reporting to the board, we did look at the MSC, the executive director's reports to the board, the MSC board, and we also found that there was a lack of information to show progress against strategic actions and performance measures. So for example, that we examined the strategic plan and there were quite a few items that were included, and we would have expected to see very clear reports on progress towards those objectives and actions that would, result in the outcomes that they were trying to achieve. And that information wasn't being presented. It may have been discussed at board meetings, but there was no documentation where it was being shown. So again, these are areas that we've noted in the report. We wanted to bring to management's attention, communicate to the board of the MSC of areas that they can consider for enhancements and improvements. The second item that we wanted to note today was related to what we found with the MSC board was a high rate of turnover in 2019. So this was, our assessment was completed almost a year ago, and we found that the turnover of the board was about 44%, which is quite high. And we felt that given the high turnover at that time and the significance that decision-making of the board has on the success of market operations, that the city consider reviewing the composition of the board to mitigate these risks, since any board decisions or a lack of decisions can impact the success of the markets. And any changes to the board would certainly require approval of council. And finally, there was one recommendation, and again, this is no longer a process that exists today. We looked at the interim period with respect to a review of shared expenditures with the BIA, and these were for marketing and promotional activities. And we found that the recommendation that we'd made, there was no evidence to see that was completed or carried out in terms of a closer review of shared expenditures and supporting invoices by staff. And that completes the presentation on this follow-up. Happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Ms. Deputy Auditor General. What staff will be assisting the committee this morning with this report? Can you just quickly wave or identify yourselves?
You're on mute, Court. You're on mute.
It looks like it will be Court Curry who will be, there he is.
Yes, good morning, Chair.
Cannot hear you.
Court, we're having a lot of trouble hearing you. You seem to be breaking up. I don't know if it's your bandwidth or your microphone, but if you could correct that. And while you're doing that, I will see Councillor El Shantiri has questions. Councillor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the Deputy Director. The question is, some of the in the report is almost redundant now, right? Because we have transferred the authority from the market to the new board. Do you agree with that?
Mr. Chair, yes, as I noted, we reviewed specific recommendations and the follow through on those for a 13-month interim period. But yes, as we noted in the report, and as I mentioned, many of these processes no longer exist, which is why we didn't spend a lot of time discussing those items.
Thank you for that. But in the future, if and that question to our staff, if something to happen and get your attention, is your job to come back to a city council with some recommendation for reforming or helping, whatever the case might be? Like, I'd like to know from here on, what is the process? That's what I'm looking for.
Great question, Councillor.
We still cannot hear you, Court. You gotta speak loud. Your microphone on low.
I apologize, Councillor.
It doesn't appear to be a volume issue. It appears to be a bandwidth issue and a connectivity issue.
Mr. Chair, I don't want to hold too much. What I'm trying to figure out as the counselor who's in charge of all the BIAs, from here on, how do we establish the working relationship? If we have an issue, where do we go to? Do we go to our staff? Is it Court Curry, is the staff person in charge of this? Or that's what I'm looking for, because clearly from the Deputy Auditor, some of the recommendation is redundant because they have a board now that they're arm's length from us.
Very good point, Mr. Councillor El Shantiri. I think there's been considerable discussion, and we need a process to deal with those recommendations as they come up. And I think we're going to see a motion towards the end of the meeting to deal with that.
Mr. Chair, since Court can't get on, may I just add a few things? Court sits on the markets board as an ex officio, and Court Curry to bring back to the board. As Councillor El Shantiri said, many of these recommendations, or several of them, are redundant now in that the board has taken over. Council receives an annual report from the board and on their financials. So you're also able to ask them at the annual general meeting any questions you may have concerning audit recommendations that should be implemented by that board. So part of this has changed significantly for us. Mr. Curry, court has only so much ability to be able to push that. This is now a direct relationship with the elected council and that board. That's where the reporting relationship lies, and staff are playing a coordinating liaison role in that function. So on this one here, I would respectfully say that while some recommendations have been implemented, there are several of them that are now no longer within the purview of city staff to do that because of the governance structure that council set up with that board. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Kanellakis, thank you. Noted. The recommendations from the Office of the Auditor General did come to this committee and to council, and I think that's what we'll be following up on. And if they, if there is also a reporting mechanism, recognizing there's also a reporting mechanism directly from the Municipal Service Corporation directly to council, I recognize that, but there are some reports that are dealt with at this committee. I think Mr. Curry may have fixed his issue. Did you want to give it a try, Mr. Curry?
Thank you, Chair. And thank
there
you,
we go.
I apologize for our technical difficulties. I don't have much more to add. The city manager summed up management's position very ably.
Thank you very much, and thank you. I have Councillor DeBruce next, please.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much. Through you, I want to thank the Deputy AG for the presentation. I probably quick small questions in regarding for management. And I know I saw in the report that the Auditor General suggested some suggestion for some of them for the governance and the governance. I just have a question. Are these being implemented or are currently in progress? And specifically, the information I'm looking on the performance and progress on the strategic actions that the improvement of that strategic action. So I just want to know some of that. If you can shed some light on that, that would be great.
Thank you for the question, Councillor. And I, as I tried to say earlier, I want to thank the Deputy Auditor General for her and her staff's work with us on this follow-up audit. In particular, this audit recommendation, I believe, has improved management's initial response to the audit. Ottawa Markets Corporation, as the city manager advised, has been in existence since January 2018. They did establish their first strategic plan last year in 2019. This year, they have now established 20 performance indicators to match their strategic plan and their vision as approved by council. We had a board meeting this past Monday night. I attended, as the city manager noted, ex officio, and the executive director ran through those performance indicators with the board. Council also saw at the meeting of the members this past June, enhanced reporting beyond the financial and operational reporting that the organization had done the last few years. So we believe now, and it's a credit to the Auditor General, the office for advising us further, that this recommendation fully is satisfied.
Any follow-ups, Councillor DeRose, or other questions? You are on mute, Councillor DeRose. You're the first one. You're the first one that happens to, I'm sure. Yeah.
I apologize. It's technology, but I keep forgetting to hit unmute because of the feedback. But anyway, my second question, a follow-up question. Thank you. I know that we talked a little bit about the board turnover. Has this been improved or stayed the same? Because as this audit came in 2016, and in the last few years, can you give us a little bit quick update on that? That would be great.
Councillor, as the Deputy Auditor General noted, there was significant turnover of this volunteer board in its first 2 years as it stormed and normed. In the last year, since June 2019, when the auditor completed Deputy Auditor completed her review, the board has stabilized. We have a chair, and we have 8 of 9 board positions full, with 0 turnover this year. 1 member has just recently resigned for personal reasons, but I can assure committee and council that the board has stabilized.
new executive director, and quite an interesting mix of skill sets on a very strong board.
Thank you very much for the update, and thank you, Mr. Chair. I have no more questions.
Thank you, Councillor DeRuse. Councillor Hubley, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have a couple of questions. I note the follow-up on the cash handling and the overtime. We're saying that things are better than they were, but it's up to the board now to decide what they're doing with that. But the cash handling directly affects any monies that may come to the city on this as well, do they not?
Councillor, great question, and certainly that was an important part of the 2016 audit. Our staff here at the city did work with Ottawa Markets and revenue staff to establish a cash handling policy for the new organization. It is very similar to the City of Ottawa's own cash handling process. And I believe the Deputy Auditor General would agree that upon her office's review, there is a sufficient policy in place. As an aside, that organization is not handling very much cash in this day and age, particularly in the last 9 months. Most is now electronic.
Okay, thank you. And then my next question is to do with following up the original audit, found, let's just say, questionable or suspicious activity going on with the management of the revenues from the market. And I believe we couldn't even question the person that was in charge of it at the time or anything. I'm just wondering, was there any follow-up done on that to see if there was any taxpayers' dollars that were lost here that could be recovered? Was there any effort done on that?
Mr. Chair, I can answer that question. What we found in the original audit was a lack of controls. We did not find any evidence that there were funds misappropriated. And in our report, what we outlined was that there weren't adequate controls that could prevent or detect if funds had been misappropriated. But we did not find any evidence, direct evidence of that. So our recommendation, in those situations, if there is evidence that something direct, that likely would warrant an investigation, it would have proceeded on that basis. We made very specific and very detailed recommendations to management to carry out to make sure that appropriate controls were put in place to ensure that there was enough prevention and detection to mitigate the risks that were found in that audit. They did complete many of those. Our final assessment, again, in that interim period, and those processes are no longer existing today, we did find a couple of items where there wasn't, a double sign off on the reports of revenue and cash. So it wasn't that they hadn't completed all the controls, but there were a few areas where the controls weren't functioning to the level that was recommended. But again, there were no indications for us either in the audit and the follow-up. We weren't reviewing the cash from a prior period that gave any indications that anything there was wrongdoing committed.
Okay, so the fact that there wasn't rent collected on a number of the units for years or anything wasn't an indicator that something had happened here?
Sorry, Mr. Chair, can you clarify the question? I'd understood that to be a
the
question
original
regarding...
audit, yeah, the original audit and the follow-ups that you're talking about here today, I understood at the time, I thought that there was evidence that rent had not been collected for all of the units included in the market piece. And that was something that was a question out of the first one was why not? Like, was the expenses being written off against the rent negated any rent being paid? I'm just curious. I thought after the audit there was going to be what you just mentioned, some sort of investigation or some kind of a look back at it. And I'm just wondering why we didn't hear any more about that.
So, Madam Deputy Auditor General, I believe the member has gone from cash control to the applicability of rent and some of the elements that were included in the annual net rent, which was another recommendation in the report.
Yeah.
Mr. Chair, perhaps I could address the councillor's question. The councillor is quite correct. We identified a number of instances where activities that were the responsibility of particular individuals weren't done, and we're restricted by what evidence exists, and when someone hasn't done something, our role is to point out that what should have been done was part of somebody's responsibility, part of their job description. What should have been done wasn't done. There was also, the idea of oversight. If somebody's responsible for something, then those individuals to whom they report should be overseeing their activity as well. We pointed out what wasn't done, and there was no evidence that we were able to find that it was deliberately done for a particular reason. But other than identifying that activities that should have verified that expenses that were claimed as part of a lease were legitimate, with that activity not being done, we pointed it out. Why they didn't do it is up. The only people that know why they didn't do it are the individual themselves and the supervisor. We brought the situation to light, and as far as we know, there was no evidence to indicate that individuals deliberately decided not to do it for any particular reason.
Thank you, Mr. Auditor General. Just a follow up to that part, would it be a fair statement to say that we wouldn't even know about any of the things that were going wrong there if there wasn't an audit done and then follow-ups to it?
Mr. Chair, one of the purposes of audits is to provide accountability and transparency, and that's what this process is all about. So, Councillor is quite correct.
Mr. Chair, may I have an opportunity, please?
Thank you, Mr. Willis. Yes.
Certainly, I support what the Auditor General said, and it's very helpful, the historic context he gave, and I thank him and the Deputy Auditor General for their work on this. This does predate my tenure at the city, but we did look at this issue in depth at the time of the transfer to the MSC, and understanding that the issue in dispute was not an issue of misappropriation. It was a legal dispute between the applicability of contractual matters, and the city did review this in detail and did do a legal risk assessment about the chances of succeeding in a legal action, and decided at the time the cost of pursuing action would exceed the value of the loss. So we made a decision in taxpayers' interests not to spend legal dollars to pursue money we did not have a high chance of recovering. So there was no evidence of misappropriation. It was a legal dispute in a contract at the time, and the city's realty services at the time was aware of it and very involved with support from legal services. But as the Deputy Auditor General has said and the Auditor General said, it's all about having good controls in process, which we're helping the MSC ensure that those are in place, and the MSC is a very willing and cooperative partner in that.
Okay, that's good for me. Thank you, Mr. Willis. Thank you, Mr. Chair. No more questions.
Thank you, Councillor Hubley. And yes, at its source, I think it's reconciling the cost elements that go in. What's the shared cost or the fixed cost or to establish the annual rent, and I understand. I recognize and I receive the comments by the general manager. I have a quick question to the Deputy Auditor General, and thank you for your report. And it's on cash handling. I'm just trying to reconcile recommendation 5, which you assess as partially complete, and recommendation 6, which you assess at which the Office of the Auditor General assesses as complete. Both of them seem to deal with cash handling policy. Recommendation 5 spells out a lot of the policies, and recommendation 6 just says compliant with corporate cash management policies. Can you explain to me a little bit why 5 is partially complete, but 6 is complete when they kind of say the same thing?
Hey, Mr. Chair, the difference between the two recommendations was number 5 was specific to markets management. So that was the operational group that was operating and conducting all activities at the markets. Whereas number 6 was a recommendation to the city as a whole, largely focused to the Treasury Department. So in number 5, what you can see there in the recommendation are very prescriptive recommendations we made with respect the procedures to the markets, because they had a unique process there with a homemade system and different controls that they had. They were offsite in a separate office and so forth. So we made very specific recommendations there due to the severe deficiencies in cash handling controls on site. And because of the environment that we found there, we felt it warranted a larger recommendation to the city as a whole in terms of considering what they could do to ensure that that kind of situation wouldn't be repeated elsewhere at the city, so that they would sort of consider how they can ensure for the city as a whole, where there are cash handling processes in place, that those are sound and they're appropriate and they have an appropriate level of control for that operation. Because as you can imagine, there are many operations across the city that handle cash, and it's very challenging to create a set of policies and procedures that can apply and be carried out by all in the same manner, which is why the Treasury Department sets the policies and procedures at a higher level and then requires each area that has cash handling operations to have their own specific procedures as required to ensure that there are sound controls in place. And that's the basis of the second recommendation. So in the first case, with respect to the operations occurring at the market, we did find when we reviewed the information that was available for that 13-month period, and again, these controls are no longer operational, but we did find some gaps where there were lack of dual signatures on some reports. So we couldn't assess it as fully complete because they weren't operating all the controls effectively. Whereas when we looked at what the Treasury Department had put in place across the city, and again, we can't examine every area that handles cash, but we felt that the enhancements that they made were reasonable to further the awareness and self-assessments they put in place to different areas to ensure that they had good processes in place for cash handling.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Auditor General, for that thorough answer. Seeing no other hands up on this and just confirming that no one else wants to ask questions, we're going to go on to the next element of the Auditor General's report, which is, I believe, childcare.
Monsieur le Président, this past spring, we followed up on the recommendations made in the 2017 audit of childcare services. We made quite a number of recommendations in the original audit, and they covered a wide range of activities aimed at improving management and operation of childcare services. Our follow-up found that management has made good progress, with 24 of 31 recommendations being assessed as fully implemented, an implementation rate of close to 80%. 6 of the recommendations were partially implemented, and 1 is no longer applicable. 2 of the 6 implementations that were partially implemented relate to the initial assessment process. And this is where the applications for childcare subsidies are received from parents and caregivers, and they're assessed for eligibility by city staff. The original audit recommended that the city improve the initial assessment process and that supervisors review the assessments made by their staff. We found that management implemented a plan to improve the initial assessment process. However, further work was required. They still need to review and monitor the results of the supervisor's file reviews and use these results to identify areas for staff development and training. The third and fourth partially implemented recommendations relate to the review of the city's municipal child care program. I'll refer to it as the MCC program. And this is the program where the city actually operates the child care centers. The original audit found that the review of this program had not been completed and that a cost-benefit analysis had not been conducted. Our follow-up found that management had completed a draft of its MCC review. However, they were still in the process of finalizing the report and it had not yet been presented to committee and council. Management is planning to report to committee and council at a later date, and we feel it is important for them to continue to do so and to follow through on this. We also noted that how the cost of childcare spaces is communicated, at least in that draft report, could be improved. The report compares council-approved user fees to community rates that are charged primarily by nonprofit organizations that also that operate childcare centers. However, the council-approved user fees do not recover the city's full cost of operating the MCCs. The city's full cost per space, which is roughly double the council-approved user fee, is not presented. We believe that comparing the city's full cost per space to the prices charged by other operators is an important part of a full cost-benefit analysis. The fifth recommendation that was partially implemented relates to bring forward items that are identified in clients' files. So it just has to do with the items that have been identified and making sure they get cleaned up. And the last partially implemented recommendation relates to completion of a development plan as part of a succession plan for staff. Finally, the recommendation that is no longer applicable relates to procedures for spreadsheets that are no longer used. Mr. Chair, are there any questions related to this follow-up?
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Auditor General, Mr. Meyer, for that report. Can staff just identify who will provide answers to committee members on this? I see Mr. Sabourin has come on. You're the staff member that will?
Mr. Mayor, both Jason and myself will be on this morning to answer questions.
Thank you, Ms. Gray, and thank you very much. Councillor Kavanaugh, you have questions, please.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the update. Childcare is incredibly important for the gender equity file, and the city plays a major role in it. So we want it to be well done, and I appreciate that that it has been audited and recommendations have mostly been followed. My question is about technology. It was mentioned that some of the inputting was done by hand, and of course there was issues. Has there been a technology problem in terms of how we keep track of wait lists, etc., since we have had inaccuracies?
I'll ask Mr. Sabourin to talk about that, because the system is dependent on technology that is provincial systems, and he can speak to the delays as a result of that.
Chair, through you, just a bit of the background of this. The city, as its new role of service system manager, kind of took over the whole wait list back in just prior to 2016. So yes, there was some initial steps there to bring in more technology. We actually have a childcare registry and waitlist technology tool that we use to manage it. As the initial audit kind of pointed out, there was duplicates from kind of the carryover from when it came over to us from the previous service provider that was managing it. We used this new technology going forward to make improvements to make sure we had better data. So yes, there is the data. I think when the initial audit happened, it was in that first couple of years of that software being installed, and all the audit recommendations related to that around the duplicates and waitlist information that we have been cleaned up to ensure that we have the appropriate data to make proper evidence-based decisions.
Okay, so you're saying this was provincial software that you were given?
No, just to clarify, we do have a provincial system that we are given for case management. It's the Ontario childcare case management system. It's the provincial system that most cities are using. There is a portal of that system for waitlist management. However, there are some shortcomings with the provincial system. The choice was made back in 2015, 2016 to use another software because of the enhancements that were needed and the limitations of the provincial system. So we do have multiple systems using this. The case management is the provincial system, but the waitlist and the registry tool is another software.
Okay, so that's unique to us. Has it made a difference on the wait lists? Have we seen improvements?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, from a non-technical perspective, the significant investments in the last few years in childcare has made a significant difference in the wait list. In a simple term, our fee subsidy budget is sufficient to provide financial supports for Ottawa residents. There might be a few months where it takes to do that, but right now we currently have about 800 families waiting for financial approval. This is not uncommon in the month of September when we often see the most turnover, and we fully anticipate that in a couple of weeks, all those families will have financial approval to secure a placement.
Okay, so we won't have a backlog then, you expect?
Typically, we see about 200, 300 families coming in per month. And as I said, our normal kind of attrition rate with families leaving the system is around the same. So there is a few months waiting period, but the budget itself is kind of is sufficient for the demand.
Okay, I know this is slightly off topic, but is COVID affecting this process? COVID.
It is, yeah. So in addition to kind of the financial impacts or the financial impacts of the fee subsidy budget, we do have approximately 800 families who are pre-approved for financial support who are trying to secure a placement right now. There's kind of two aspects to this in the sense of parents still trying to navigate this COVID situation and making a decision just like schools of if they are going to return to that. The other aspect is the community providers are still trying to get back to full capacity in a safe manner. So there is still not full capacity of the childcare sector, which could minimize the access that parents have at this point. Providers are working really hard to get back to that full access. It's a difficult environment right now.
Okay, so we've gotten rid of all the duplications that were in before. Is that correct?
Correct, yes. As the auditor mentioned, that recommendation has been completed.
Okay, I appreciate this very much, and I think it's important that we keep our childcare strong, and because this is very crucial at this time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Kavanagh. Councillor Hubley, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. This is another one of those important audits. Like when this was first tabled, it was shocking to learn that money that could have went towards providing childcare spaces was being wasted because there was no follow-ups going on with people receiving money that shouldn't have been receiving it. And so a couple of questions I have on that is I see that there's now a process in place to catch duplicates. There's percentage of files that are reviewed and everything. What I didn't see in there in the 3 recommendations related to that was I didn't see what's being done as a follow-up when they find something in that review that needs to be checked, or that maybe someone got money that shouldn't have got it. Could I get some detail on, is there any effort to do a follow-up there? And if so, what is it?
Chair, absolutely. Maybe just a bit of the context too, in the sense of, I actually just came on too after this audit was presented. I thank the auditor for kind of pinpointing a lot of these areas because there was a lot of significant areas of concern. This audit really helped us pinpoint the areas that we needed to look into. Specifically with the question, our error rate right now is actually below 2%. However, there is still a process where someone forgot to notify us of an eligibility concern, we have an overpayment recovery process where we would go back and collect the funds back from those parents if something changed in their eligibility. And all the annual reviews are up to date. So a lot of significant work has been done on this audit. We definitely prioritize this audit because of those significant concerns raised.
And I want to be the first to say that there's been a huge progress made on this file since the original audit. Like I know it certainly woke up council and senior management of the city as to what the problems were in this area. So I want to let you know, I do appreciate the work that is going on with this. With respect to those overpayments that you were just talking about, what's our collection efforts and results like? Are we collecting most of that money? Because I believe in the original audit where they pinpointed one of the areas where there was money being lost was nobody was coming forward and saying, okay, I don't need the subsidy anymore. So people were getting it long past the time when kids were, their kids would have been eligible. So how are we doing on the collection of that overpayment of tax dollars?
Yeah, so just to walk through the process a little bit, we do a fairly good job at collecting the funds back. I mean, you keep in mind that the clientele that we are supporting are the most vulnerable. That's the reason why they need the fee subsidy. We take a very soft approach in the sense of the partnership of how they can pay these funds back if there was something that they just missed in informing us that created the overpayment. So while they're on fee subsidy, we treat them as our clients and we create repayment plans with parents and families to make sure that they can fit this within their budget. If for some reason they've left the system or we have no contact with them, we do rely on our finance colleagues, and there's a whole overpayment recovery process through that process that finance might be able to better speak to, but it is collected one way or the other, whether it's through our clients or through the revenue department through the overpayment recovery process.
That's good to hear, and I appreciate the sensitivity that you're bringing to it, because often it could be at no fault of their own that you know, we all know how fast kids can grow up to that. So I appreciate hearing what you're doing with that, and that there's processes in place now to make sure that that doesn't happen going forward. Because that money that got, let's say, I'm going to use the term misallocated, just for lack of a better one right now. But that money, once it's collected and brought back in, it goes back into the program to help people that are actually eligible for the child subsidies. Is that correct?
Correct, in the sense that any parental contribution actually helps our budget so that we can support more families.
Okay, and then my last question is to do it on page 8 of the audit, where it says no cost benefit analysis was done. I thought it was standard practice in the city now to do cost benefit analysis before undertaking anything like this. Can someone give an answer as to why a cost benefit wasn't done?
Yeah, Chair, there was a cost benefit done, not a formal one. I think for me, when I looked at this and the significant concerns raised in the audit around the data that we needed to maximize the supports for families, we looked at the cost, which was fairly minimal. We have one provider with the technology. I made the decision at that time, because of the low cost, to push it forward as soon as we could to ensure that we could maximize those funds for families and make better informed decisions moving forward.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. That's my questions. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you, Councillor Hubley. Just a couple of comments and follow-ups. Mr. Minor, the two recommendation 2 on page 8, you indicate complete, but you in the OAG, Office of the Auditor General's assessment, they did not, you indicate, management indicated they did not do a cost benefit analysis before moving in this direction. Mr. Minor, can you reconcile that for us with what Mr. Sabourin's just said?
Certainly. I mean, what we wanted to see was that they evaluate the costs and the benefits of going ahead. And like you said, not every decision has to be a formal cost benefit analysis. And from what we saw, you know, for management and the decision that they took, you know, it looked reasonable under the circumstances. So we didn't see a need to say that was partially complete. There's any further work to be done. It looked to us like they had done what the spirit of what we were looking for, that they evaluate those costs and benefits.
Okay, thank you. Just advising you and Ms. Brennan, you're cutting out a little bit, so maybe sometimes we'll ask you to turn off your video. There's a bit of bandwidth issue. Mr. Sabourin, thank you very much for your answer to the questions by Councillor Hubley. You said you referred to a 2% error rate, and I appreciate that there'll be errors. The substance of the audit originally, some of the elements had to do with files not being reviewed for 29 months. That is not an error rate. That is a management process to ensure that impacts our residents' fees that they pay, their eligibility, other people getting on the program. It impacts parents getting to work and using the services that are offered by the city. So I don't want to leave the impression, we recognize errors, absolutely. What's not acceptable is files not being reviewed for 29 months, and I hope that there is progress in that. For management, recommendation 22 was talked about for a good while. It was supposed to be done in October 2017, I will point out. And Mr. Sabourin, you and I have exchanged with my office. The follow-up says that it was planned to come to committee and council now in 2020. Can you give us an update as to when we're going to see the municipal child care program review that we've been waiting for so long?
Yeah, absolutely. If I can take the chance, the chair, to just go back to your previous comments, I couldn't agree with you more. The 29-month backlog that was saw in the original audit should not be happening. When I came in, we put that as the #1 priority. The backlog was completed within a year, and annual reviews are current. The error rate is actually something different. It is just with the initial assessment around the eligibility and was something missed as part of that paperwork. The annual reviews are current, and they remain current right now to ensure those people who are on the system continue to be eligible. Municipal childcare report. So just a bit of the backlog here too of the time it's taken us a bit is because of the significant growth in the sector. We've never seen this kind of transformation in childcare, which is amazing. It's amazing for families, amazing for more spaces. But we had to take some time to get that data and assess it to properly present to council that information. As well as the audit pointed out, we needed to do some work with the costing methodology to ensure council had the most appropriate details. We were fully planning on bringing that to committee in April. Unfortunately, March kind of threw us a little bit in a different direction with starting emergency childcare and making sure that the sector has these financial supports and the supports from Ottawa Public Health to stay viable and safe during this time period. At this point in time, we need just a bit of an opportunity to kind of assess COVID because it is having an impact on the sector, and there has been closures. There is still providers trying to get back to full capacity. So we needed a bit of an opportunity just to take COVID in mind to relook at that report. And we do anticipate, bearing where COVID goes, that we will be able to present that to committee and council in Q1 2020.
Q1 2020 or Q1 2021?
Apologize. Yes, 21.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And but I will just point out the original management response. This work will be completed by Q4 2017.
No, absolutely, Chair. If I can take an opportunity to speak to that. When we came in and had this initial audit, we did look at what we could complete. The unknown for us was actually the transformation this sector has gone under over the last 3-4 years. We've seen unprecedented amounts of funding come into this sector. And I would probably argue that the sector hasn't seen this type of transformation since 1970 when this is childcare kind of started. We've seen 2,000 more fee subsidies available. We've seen capital investments to have 400 new spaces in Ottawa. We've had the Journey Together initiative to increase the Indigenous childcare. We've had to re-transform the early on. All these were kind of unknowns at the time of that. What we did look at, and I hope everyone sees, we did take this audit seriously, but we also had to prioritize the programs that were going to have direct impacts. And often, because these are provincial legislative, they come with the dictation from the province of when they need to be completed, when the funds need to be spent. So we had to prioritize all these other programs as well that were going to have direct impacts on families.
You are right. There were 31 recommendations, a lot of recommendations. Most are complete. 24 are complete. You've done outstanding work and I appreciate it. We always want to do better. Just had one more question. The recommendation 12, which is listed as complete in the report, has to do with technology to allow parents to electronically submit their documentation. I know that we talked a little bit earlier about data, but electronically submit documentation. And I guess my question might be is for the Office of the Auditor General. You've assessed it as complete, even though it's written the expected launch date is 2020 after pilot testing has been completed. Why are you saying it's complete even though it hasn't been implemented yet?
Thank you, Chair. In this case, part of it is what we actually, the finer points of what we recommended, and we didn't recommend that they implement a technological solution in this. And what the reason is, it might not have been it may not have been a feasible thing to recommend. So we said, listen, consider it, look at it, and see if it makes sense for you. And that's sort of where we went on that. Is we wanted to see them consider it seriously, think about whether or not it made sense for them. When we came back to do our follow-up, they had considered it. They said it did make sense for them, and they were in the process of moving that. So as far as we were concerned, that was a completed recommendation.
Noted. As I read the recommendation, you asked them that they consider it, they have done, and bonus, we're going to implement it. That's great. I think that's it for the child care audit. The next one is the Lansdowne audit. So I will turn it over to the Office of the Auditor General, and I will also ask the Vice Chair to assume the chairmanship of this committee for a few moments. Thank you.
Madam Vice Chair, if I could just point out that late last night, while reading the report, we noticed that there was a minor error on page 24 of this report, and we will be making that change and updating the reports that we've sent to the members of the committee and to the Councillor's Drive. And they will be, the versions that will go up on the website will be the accurate and complete version.
Noted. Can you just give us a one-page summary of the error that you noted?
I think one of the things that...
One sentence summary, I think.
One of the things that that we've discussed before is that when I showed you the process, that the recommendations and the management comments come at the end of the process, and it's a complete discussion between the office and the auditee, and the version that we make a number of version changes, and one of the things that we forgot to do was to take out a couple of sentences that remained from that process.
Noted. Thank you. Thank you for the thorough work you do. We'll turn it over to your office for presentation, and Vice Chair Meehan, if you could chair the meeting.
This is a first. So thank you very much, Chair. It'd be my pleasure. So we're taking a look now at the audit for Lansdowne, and is it Sonia or Ed who will be delivering the report?
Mr. Chair, through to you, I will be presenting on this report.
Can just go ahead then, Sonia. Thank you.
Thank you. So the original audit was conducted in 2017, and to go through some of the key aspects of the original audit, the overall responsibility for Lansdowne Park lies with the Recreation, Culture and Facility Services Department, and they draw on other city departments to provide support to manage all the agreements that that compromise the partnership with the city. We found at that time that there was a good working relationship between the city and its P3 partner, and this is very important. And we find that good relationship continues today. At the time of our audit, we found that there was no comprehensive approach or document or tools to effectively track and monitor compliance with all relevant aspects of the partnership plan agreements. And to characterize these agreements, there's approximately 70 very lengthy, very complex agreements that are required, that have obligations with both partners to be carried out, that have been contractually agreed to. We also found at that time that there wasn't complete awareness by both city staff and the partners of certain reporting requirements that were contained in those agreements. And we had found that more than half of the financial and operational and technical reporting requirements hadn't been met at that time. Trust accounts for the stadium and the parking garage reserve funds were not set up. Insurance requirements were not being monitored or reviewed. We also found that the city did not have an established risk management plan for the partnership. And when it was transitioned from the construction phase to the operational phase, we found that this was done without a sufficient transition plan. So in this follow-up audit, we reviewed progress that was made on 17 recommendations from this audit. We have found that management has fully implemented 6 of the 17 recommendations, partially completed 9. 1 was not started, and 1 we were unable to assess. What I want to acknowledge is that significant improvements have been made since the time of our audit. Tools and processes have been developed. There are much clearer roles and responsibilities. However, we have noted there are some areas that require improvement. With respect to the 9 partially complete recommendations, many of these are directly or closely related to ensuring that there's an effective tracking and monitoring for compliance to all the agreements. We did not find that the process was wholly effective or efficient to monitor the agreements. The activities are entirely manual, which make it difficult to ensure that information is current and accurate as well as being inefficient. We did find that some of the information was in fact not current or complete. The document that was put in place also does not enable, it doesn't enable you to determine whether or not that the information being received effectively satisfies the obligation in the contracts. And it also didn't track receipt or completion of all these items. Along with this, we found that the responsibilities are decentralized. And what that does is it increases the potential for misinformation, for data inconsistencies, and potential miscommunications. So overall, having a decentralized process to monitor and oversee all these contracts, it does increase the risk that the city may not be effectively monitoring or tracking compliance. There remained some proof of insurance was still outstanding. As well, when we examined the risk management plans, we found that they didn't include some significant financial or infrastructure maintenance risks that we thought should be tracked and monitored due to the level of risk. 2 of our partially complete recommendations warranted a new recommendation be made, and these are outlined in our report. Specifically, in the original audit, we recommended that the city take action to ensure that trust accounts for reserve funds were set up as agreed to in both the stadium lease and the parking structure reciprocal agreements. In our follow-up, we found that the partners had set up capital replacement funds accounts, and these are not formal trust accounts. So in our report, we have reasserted with a new recommendation that the city ensure that the accounts are converted to formal trust accounts, or that some other equally strong assurances are put in place to ensure that the money that's set aside is used for their intended purposes and are protected for city use. Management has agreed with that recommendation. We also noted in our report that the implementation of the city's P3 guidelines, it requires that employees responsible for these projects possess some baseline knowledge and experience in managing large, complex infrastructure service contracts in order to ensure that they're effectively being managed. So we did recommend that the city develop a P3 framework, P3 management framework, and establish a centralized center of expertise to provide enhanced management to ensure a strong, consistent approach to how these contracts are managed over time. And management has agreed to some actions to mitigate the risks that were identified. There was one recommendation we were unable to assess. However, on this item, our work highlighted an item that led us to formulate a third recommendation. Specifically, we found that we were unable to assess whether or not P3 guidelines and such were being followed because there were no P3 agreements that had come in place during this time period that we could evaluate. But when we started looking at this recommendation, we first examined the Arts Courts agreement with the impression that this was actually a P3 arrangement. We found that it was not, but we did note that it did include many elements, a number of elements that when we examined the criteria in the city's policy of what a P3 is, we found that many of the similar aspects were present in that criteria. So as a result of that, we recommended that the city review and revise the policy to make sure that the criteria for classification of a P3 is clear and that there's a formal evaluation that for agreements that are similar in nature, that it's evaluated against this criteria so that the classification is clear after the fact. And finally, one recommendation was assessed as not started. And this is related to monitoring of life cycle plans for the stadium and the parking structures. And what we found here was that the city was not effectively monitoring the life cycle plans when we had requested our update in October 2019. At that time, what we found were that annual reports of expenses related to capital repairs and replacements for 2017 and 2018 were provided. However, they weren't monitored or reviewed against the plans. The risk here is that if required repairs or replacements with respect to these assets aren't completed or completed in a timely fashion, they could result in additional costs down the road. Since the time of our initial assessment, the city has begun to draft process documentation and has developed a tool to track the previous period from 2014 to 2018. So with respect to the new recommendations, we do intend to follow up on those at a later date when management has had an opportunity to complete the items that we've considered as new recommendations. Happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Auditor General. Vice Chair Meehan has questions, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Ms. Brennan, for that report. I do note that with six, can you hear me? Mm-hmm. Hello? Yeah? Okay. I do know that with 6 recommendations complete out of 17 on this Lansdowne project, that basically is an F. It's a failing grade. And I find it kind of disturbing because this was such an important contract at the time, and it was controversial, as you know. I actually I don't know who will be answering this, if it's going to be Recreation Facilities Management, but why was there no framework for the P3 put in place before we tackled this project? I think that is an essential step that we were obviously missing here, and it leads to a series of concurrent problems. So I thought we were assured at the time that we had the expertise and the team was in place. Clearly that didn't happen. So why not?
Chair, at the time of the Lansdowne P3, there was in fact a framework, and the work that was done for this program, and I see Mr. McDonald is on. He can speak to city's framework and policy. But in fact, and I think those are documents that have evolved. When you're talking about Lansdowne, you're talking as far back as 2009. I think there's been significant work done in terms of lessons learned in the field of P3, and for the P3s that we have negotiated in those years, the framework that was established and approved by council has always been the guiding document. And I don't know if Will wants to add to
that. Mr. Chair, to that point, the original P3 policy was developed in 2013. It has since gone through a number of substantive updates since that point, most recently in 2018 as a result of the recommendations from this audit. And so the P3 framework has been improved as a result of the feedback from the Auditor General.
I appreciate that, and I'm glad to hear it. But at the same time, when we undertook this project, we did so with the understanding that we had the expertise in place. Whose responsibility is it to ensure that the staff has the knowledge and the legal understanding of what we're entering into here? This is an extremely complicated agreement that we were entering into, and it's clear from what the audit recommendations are saying that we were lax when it came to that. I think that's a nice word.
Chair, it's Steve Box, if I may speak to respond to this.
Please.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we did have an Ottawa option in place at the time that these unsolicited proposals were received. And we also did have a dedicated resource, Rob McKay, who had P3 expertise and has subsequently gone on to work with P3 Canada. So we did have those resources and that expertise in place. And prior to that, we had Réjean Chartrand who oversaw P3 office. So we did have centralized technical expertise at the time that we entered this agreement. And we also brought on, as you can imagine, expertise in terms of legal and technical construction and elements of the business case that were developed as the negotiations progressed on this P3 or on this partnership.
If that's true, Mr. Box, why these recommendations? And management understood, they accept that the recommendations, why the Auditor General recommended that the changes be happening. So help me understand what happened here.
The P3 function, as was identified, was evolved. The P3 policies were improved, but I can't speak to why the auditors has recommended or is indicating that there were no expertise or centralized framework in place when we did have the Ottawa option in place, and we did have a dedicated resource or expertise in P3 at the time that we entered into these negotiations, and those were included in the reports that were in front of committee and council at the time that we got direction from council to advance on this initiative to continue to negotiate with OSEG and develop the legal contracts, and all the legal framework came back to committee and council for approval.
We're losing money. We're losing money here. How much have we been able to recover of the funds that were identified?
Chair, I can add to Steve's comments that of the outstanding recommendations, the things that are partially complete at this point, several of them are items that, as Ms. Brennan mentioned, the agreements are probably unprecedented in terms of the volume and complexity of them. And departments have worked with legal services to create, as you read through the audit, a fairly comprehensive matrix of all of the obligations that we need to that we need to follow up on. The follow-up audit, I think, further refined that to show that we still need to do some more work in terms of a better tool. The current matrix is managed through an Excel spreadsheet, and we are going to look at better project management software and a dedicated resource to look at some of those things. But some of the shortcomings that didn't get us a full complete, I think, are working our way through exactly what the requirements are. And I believe 3 or 4 of the recommendations, for example, identified and assigned responsibility for certain areas of follow-up for this. And the department, I guess, has now clarified that not only do we need to identify the department and the work unit, but we should also be identifying a specific staff to do that. And I believe once we do that, at least 3, perhaps more of the recommendations will be pretty close to being complete. One of the recommendations is that we get a better system, and procurement, I believe, is looking at a new contract management software for the city. And if we are hopeful that that will be a good fit, and that introducing that into our monitoring will fully satisfy that recommendation in terms of having the appropriate tool to do the work.
It feels to me, Mr. Shinley, like the horse got out of the barn. The recommendations came too late. I was just wondering if I could ask the Auditor General, could Mr. AG, could many of these problems have been avoided had the city had a comprehensive framework in place, like you're asking for now, if it had been in place prior to going ahead with this Lansdowne deal?
Mr. Chair, through you to the councillor, I think the reason why, let me just go back a bit. I think the reason why we did this audit when we did was to prevent a situation where it's too late to do anything about it. There were a number of people who asked why we were not doing an audit of the management of the contract earlier. Well, the first thing we had to do was we had to wait until implementation happened and until some of the management activities had happened. So I think the timing of the initial audit was bang on, and we did identify that there were some areas where the management of the contract could be improved, and at the same time we saw that there were aspects around management of a P3 that hadn't been identified before. But going forward, should there be other P3s, and in the management of this P3, some changes could and should be implemented. So thankfully, it is not too late to make these changes. This was certainly the largest project that the city had undertaken at the time, and I'm pleased to say that that through the audit and through this follow-up, management and this office has spent a lot of time working on how moving forward management could better manage that contract, and at the same time also introduce some improvements into just the definition of P3s, should there be another one in the future.
Okay.
So in answer to your question, it isn't too late, thankfully, and I think these 3 recommendations that we're coming up with, which management is totally in agreement with, and which the office will follow up on in due course, hopefully quickly, because these some of these items have been outstanding for some time. But I guess in answer, it isn't too late, but I think everyone is glad that not only the audit happened when it did, but that the follow-up happened when it did.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear that, Mr. AG. I'll just say, though, that when we enter into these, I think that we at City Council, and I think the taxpayer who ultimately foots the bill for this, want to be confident that we have the expertise in place to tackle these right from the get-go. And I'm hoping that these recommendations will go a long ways to improving that amount of trust. So thank you. That's it for me. Thanks.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. Councilor Menard, I'm happy that you were able to rearrange your schedule to be with us. Councilor Menard.
Yes, thanks very much, Chair. I was able to delay that meeting to later today. So thanks for that. I wanted to start just by saying that, you know, there is a good relationship in terms of our CFS. They do work closely with the partners there and my office. And you know, the issues I'm raising here today really don't have anything to do with our CFS performance. This is an issue for the city across the board, similar to Councillor Meehan's comments. I'm sorry, I'm not looking right at the screen. I've got 2 screens here in the office. So in this report, the AG states that P3 project risks related to asset operation and maintenance remain relevant and can be quite significant in cases where high value long-term contracts have been entered into. And AG also says the city would not receive $62 million of accrued interest on its deemed equity, and that after less than 6 years of operation, based on OSEG's current forecasts, there will not be sufficient cash flow for the city to receive its expected return on investment. Does senior city staff agree with this assessment by the Auditor General?
Mr. Chair, yes, we do, and certainly Wendy or Isabel can weigh in. But we also, and I realize this is a corollary to your question, but we've also haven't had to pay anything from city coffers to support the losses that OSEG has experienced since they've started. So that's where the city has been protected. But you're correct in the forecast of at the end of the waterfall.
And what?
I can add, it's Isabel, I can add to that. In recognition that OSEG has contributed a significant amount of additional investments in city assets. So we have benefited in the fact that they've actually contributed equity that they're not going to fully get return on.
What is the return on that additional equity they put in? 4%, 5%?
They receive 8%.
8%. Oh, they get 8% on the return. Okay. And in terms of the city's forecast for what we are going to recoup from our investment, which the investment didn't include the stadium that we paid for, right? That wasn't part of our deemed equity. What are we anticipating? $0 or?
So that was deemed equity. There is no cash outlay from the city. This has not cost us anything other than what we paid for the construction of the stadium.
No, but the $178 million that we paid originally.
Councillor Menard, if I could ask that you frame your questions with respect to the recommendations and follow-up of the report of the Auditor General.
Yeah, I was just responding to staff's response there, Chair.
Noted, but we're dealing with the report of the Auditor General.
Yeah, and the Auditor General's report says the city would not receive its financial value of accrued interest on its deemed equity. So can I ask questions about that or not?
As it relates to the report of the Auditor General.
Yes, okay. So on the investment the city made at Lansdowne, which was what the financial amount of $62 million of accrued interest on its deemed equity. It's our deemed equity that we invested in, and the refurbishment of the stadium, which was not included. What are we anticipated to recoup? How much money are we supposed to get back in terms of interest on our deemed equity is the question.
So the deemed equity is not actual cash outlay. There is no equity that was put in. The interest is just, it was an expectation from a forecast. We are not losing any interest on any cash that we would have invested. And the business case shows that we're actually saving in terms of the cost to operate the stadium. All funds flow through the waterfall, and the city is kept whole. And in the meantime, they are contributing to the life cycle fund, which is investing in our asset. So we are benefiting on the asset side.
Right. So we paid $129 million for the stadium. That's not part of our deemed equity. Is that correct?
If I could intervene again, I will remind everyone that the audit focused on the corporate governance, the oversight, and the provision of services of that P3 agreement in terms of corporate governance oversight and the provision of services. I think you are drifting away from the substance of the audit.
Okay, I'll try to get back on track, Chair, although I think these are relevant questions given how much money we did put into Lansdowne, and it seems like we're saying we didn't put any money in Lansdowne, but we invested a lot of money in Lansdowne.
The policy of the city is perhaps one for FEDCO, but I will. Mr. Hughes, did you want to, Auditor General, did you just want to provide context?
I was just going to indicate that we've conducted an audit on the waterfall, and we'll be presenting that to audit committee in due time. And some of those questions might be some of the council's questions might be answered in that audit.
Yeah, and that audit is about the Lansdowne finances and waterfall. Can you just describe when that's going to be coming? When is that expected to council? November or December?
Well, I indicated to the chair that the chair and I have talked about scheduling another audit committee, and we were going to start to talk about that after today's audit committee. So I will be gone before by the end of the year, so it will be done between now and the end of the year.
Okay, that's great. I've got a lot of other questions here, Chair. The city's P3 guidelines were reviewed, and they include specific instructions for employees responsible for P3 projects. And so as part of that discussion, the Auditor General has recommended that there is a special delivery unit or a management unit outside of the specific department that would oversee centralized P3 management. The city seems to say they agree with that, but then in reading the comments, it doesn't seem like that will take place. Can staff just comment on that?
Mr. Chair, the way that the P3 policy is structured is that the expertise to administer the P3s are really delivered from a corporate perspective. Expertise on contract administration reside within supply services. The technical expertise resides within the lead or operational department. And additional P3 specific expertise is engaged through professional services as and when required. And so we certainly agree with the recommendation that a stronger framework needs to be put into place. However, the framework as outlined in the policy would maintain.
And Mr. Chair, perhaps I could indicate, when I indicated earlier that there was an error and something that would be removed from the report, it's specifically about the creation of a P3 office. In our discussions with management, we've, and you heard Mr. Chenier talk about the hiring of a specific resource, strengthening the framework, introducing additional controls around how they were going to manage this particular P3. We were satisfied that that would address the deficiencies that we had identified, and that's why it's unfortunate the corrected version of the report will address the key issues, and it's those key issues that management agrees with, and it's the proposed solution that Mr. Chenier just spoke about that we think will address those issues. So I apologize for that error on our part.
Okay, thanks for that. Some other questions. Within the report, you say that the subject matter specific P3 expertise, so the city staff are saying this, is provided by external consultants on an as is and required and when required basis. So how much are we spending on that annually in the city in terms of hiring external consultants for their P3 expertise?
Mr. Chair, it's specific to each individual project, and I'd be pleased to follow up with the councillor with the details.
Yeah, I guess the question is on the Lansdowne contract, are we regularly hiring external consultants with P3 expertise?
So the P3 expertise is engaged during the procurement process and the establishment of the P3 agreement. Once it moves to operations and the administrative perspective, it's city staff that are now managing that contract.
Okay, I'm just responding to the report because in the report, it says that they're still hired after the contract is done and in response to what the AG is recommending in terms of a management office of P3s. And we say that subject matter specific P3 expertise is provided in response to that. So it's not just the initial contract setup, it is after the fact. And so I'm just wondering, how often has that been engaged for Lansdowne, and what are we spending on that in the city as a whole on P3 expertise, external contracts? So yeah, if you can follow up with me over email, that would be great. But if anybody knows if we've hired anyone as a P3 consultant on Lansdowne since the contract has been signed, it'd be helpful to know that now as well.
Mr. Chair, I'm not aware of any examples.
Okay. So also within the Auditor General's report, it says that a P3 policy should include a requirement for the city to formally evaluate and document agreements similar in nature to P3s against certain criteria. This would ensure that the city could support decisions relating to the classification of future opportunities, i.e. a P3 versus a non-P3, and provide clear direction with respect to the management and oversight and applicable accounting requirements relating to each initiative. So I guess to the AG, why is this such an important recommendation?
Mr. Auditor General, I think that question was to you. And Councillor Menard, you have 30 seconds left when you ask your next question.
Mr. Chair, I was waiting for Sonia Brennan to answer that, so I think it's more appropriate that she answer it.
Noted.
Yes, Mr. Chair. When we were looking for an example of a current P3 to evaluate against the process, Arts Court stood out as one that we had certainly had impressions that it was in fact a P3 arrangement. And when we examined the agreements and the structure and the nature of the project, it went against the criteria, of which there are 3, and they're fairly, they're not extremely prescriptive. It appeared as though it was a P3 arrangement. When we discussed this with the finance function, they had clarified that it was in fact not a P3 arrangement, and this was actually specifically built into those agreements. So our recommendation really speaks to the criteria that it's clear whether or not a project is a P3 or not, so that it is going to be the appropriate policies and procedures and guidelines are applied to the project.
Okay, and in the city's response, it does state in an effort to support staff, the P3 policy will be updated to provide clear criteria to help determine what constitutes a P3 and the requirement to formally evaluate new projects against this criterion. So just can city staff explain how that will work in practice? Just give me an example of how that will function and what it means to you.
Mr. Chair, the way that the P3 policy is structured is it has an overarching policy, a more detailed set of procedures, and an even more detailed set of guidelines. In the detailed guidelines, it outlines 5 models of P3s that are of particular importance to the city, which were adapted from the Canadian Council of Public-Private Partnerships. In this case, none of them meet the definition of Arts Court, and as the Deputy Auditor General pointed out, Arts Court specifically identified that it was not a P3. However, in those guidelines, it does talk about the way that the procurement or the project would be approached, including the development of a public sector comparator, an associated business case, and then the administration plan. And so in this recommendation, we agree that we would like to provide greater clarity in the policy as to what constitutes a P3 and when those elements of project management need to be incorporated formally to align with the guidelines.
Okay, thank you for that. That's helpful. Obviously, it's important to note when we're entering in a P3 or not and what that arrangement is, and that council's made fully aware of those things and the risks that come with them. I have other questions as well. Did you want me to just continue on, Chair?
Councillor Menard, you had 5 seconds left.
Sure, I'll get back on the list if you want.
Okay. Anybody else have questions or comments? Okay. Before Councillor Menard gets...
Can we reinforce to deal with the report itself, not the fundamental, whether we are pro P3 or against P3, please?
Noted, Councillor El Shantiri. Noted. before Councillor Menard has more questions on the report, I just want to say, take my turn to ask questions. Certainly, the Lansdowne P3 agreement had a substantial reputational risk, a financial risk, and operational risk. And it, as was said, it's one of the largest projects, 30 legal agreements and shared responsibility. Mr. Chenier, you said that we are going to get some software for training our staff on contract administration. Contract compliance is quite a skill set, and is certainly a departure from the usual skill sets that some of our managers have. So my comment to you on that is that we need training. To run Lansdowne Park is not the same as to manage the contracts, complex contracts for Lansdowne Park. So I want you to take that away for consideration in terms of the skill sets that are required. And in that, the reputational risk, the contract risks, why is the yearly monitoring, and this is to management, the yearly monitoring of life cycle plans of this asset, of this city asset, as recommended in and complete and agreed to, why has it not been completed after 3 years, please? That's for management.
Hi, good morning. Can you hear me and see me?
Yes, we can.
It's Shelley McDonald.
Okay.
So thank you, Chair, for the question. So as noted by the Auditor General in the follow-up report, the city has been working closely with OSEG for a number of years to monitor the progress against the life cycle plans for the stadium and for the parking garage. So through the course of the audit process, we've demonstrated to the Auditor General that the life cycle repairs were completed in 2000. Whoops. There, that's much better. Were completed in 2017 and 2018. So for those years, OSEG submitted capital replacement fund tables to the city on an annual basis in order to reconcile the work that was completed. So since the end of October 2019, the city has made significant progress working with OSEG in order to finalize those processes into documents. So then that way we are able to demonstrate that we're able to mitigate the risk through this regular monitoring and review of the life cycle plans. So the city has in place a formal process for the stadium and a second process for the parking structure. So in addition, we have also taken the information from the Morrison Hirschfield 2019 building condition assessment audit, put it into a spreadsheet in order to be able to track more clearly the required works over the next 4 years. So we believe that with these two documented processes with the spreadsheet, that we have now effective processes to enable the city to monitor the progress to complete the project works identified in the life cycle plan and to adjust and adapt as required.
Ms. McDonald, thank you. The noted yearly monitoring of all the life cycle plans is what is important so that we can make sure that we are adapting and we are changing as per the program agreement. And in that, another element of the audit is that the city is that we establish trust accounts, not just bank accounts, but trust accounts. And these were not set up, I think, as said in the audit and as was recommended in the original audit report. I think the city's considered it complete, even though it doesn't seem to be the case. Can you comment on that?
I'll ask my colleague Isabel to comment on that piece, please.
Thank you, certainly.
Mr. Chair, yeah, no, we agree with the recommendation that it needs to be set up as a trust account per the agreement. And what we said is we would follow up because when we did try to do that, there was too many restrictions imposed by the bank to manage a trust account. It could not be managed as a proper life cycle account where withdrawals were required to maintain the assets. And so we are exploring options either through other financial mechanisms or through a change in the agreement to figure out how we can protect these funds. But they are established as separate bank accounts. We reconcile it every year.
Noted. And there is, in the absence of a trust account, there is joint control of that account. We have, it is only as per the program agreement that funds can be withdrawn.
So there's processes in place to monitor that. They provide us the, it's not a joint bank account, it is an OSEG account, but they provide us bank statements and full reconciliations of those bank accounts.
Okay, thank you. Those are my questions, and seeing no other hands, I will see Councillor Kavanagh. Councillor Kavanagh, if you wish to unmute yourself, you have questions.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Following the dialogue between Isabel and Shelley, I'm in terms of what's going to be implemented, I just want to know how this is going to be done for future P3s. Is there going to be some kind of protocol put in place that will be put in place for P3s? I think that was a big problem is the identification of them, and got kind of messy. They're complicated documents, and this is very problematic. I want to know what the structure is and how they're going to compare them to other forms. Is there going to be that comparison that council will get to look at in future projects of this nature?
Mr. Chair, if I understand the question correctly, it's with regards to how P3s are structured and best practices with regards to P3s. I would note that the scope of work for KPMG, who's been engaged to do the lessons learned exercise on the stage 2 rail procurement, as part of that scope, they are to specific.
I think the question had to do with the establishment of trust accounts.
My apologies.
Is that correct, Councillor Kavanagh?
No, I'm happy with what he's saying. It's the whole process.
Then I apologize. Go ahead, Mr. McDonald.
Just to continue, it was identifying that the scope of work for the consultant that has been engaged to do the lessons learned exercise is to specifically look at the P3 policy and to compare that to best practices in other organizations. And so that will be a part of the recommendations that come back from that review.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry about that. I was just talking to the coordinator, Councillor Kavanagh. Are you done? Thank you.
I'm fine, thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Menard, back on the list in the absence of any other hands that are up.
Thanks very much, Chair. And I just want to come back to, again, the Auditor General's statement around the two different reports and what is changing. Because the Auditor General in the report that was issued to us is the suggestion, considering an alternative, that having P3 agreements would not be managed by individual departments, and that a management framework would be set up that includes a centralized P3 management office. So I just want to be clear on what's changing with the Auditor General's report. Are you saying that you still believe it's okay to have individual departments manage P3s, or are you saying that that's not the case, but you don't believe the management office is necessary? I'm trying to understand what the change is going to be.
Mr. Chair, through you to the to the councillor, what we are saying is that with the improvements that staff has indicated they would introduce, that we are okay with departments managing a P3, but it's subject to management implementing the improvements that that we have discussed that will resolve the issues that we identified.
Okay, because that's a pretty large change from the report that we just received. And
for that I apologize, but as we indicated, the recommendation was out there initially, given the problems that we had identified, and as late as the very end of last week, management indicated that they would introduce some changes that would meet our requirements and resolve the issues without the requirement to establish a specific P3 office. And we're okay with that.
Okay. The city has not yet obtained proof of insurance for the parking structure for the residential condominium. Do we have insurance for the parking structure of the residential condominium?
Mr. Chair, yes, that insurance has been received. It was received after the cutoff for the audit deadline, but all insurance certificates are now in hand.
Okay, thank you for that. The report also states that the city is not effectively identifying, analyzing, mitigating, and monitoring risks for the Lansdowne agreements. I understand there's a few action items coming out of this, but what is senior staff's response to that? How, you know, this has been a problem since the get-go of this contract. What are we doing to make sure that in the future we mitigate our risks here, we don't cost, you know, more funds to taxpayers, and that we actually get the results we're looking for in terms of our deemed equity? What are we doing that's going to help change that? And I, you know, some of it relates to the waterfall, but a lot of this is just, you know, a management piece and the agreements that we signed. So, you know, what big moves are you making to make sure that, you know, the city is protected in this?
Mr. Chair, the original audit on Lansdowne identified the risk issue, and based on that, the department moved to include Lansdowne's risk and its overall departmental risk, but at the operational level. So we were very much focused on, much as we are with operating arenas or pools or other public facilities, the operational risk. The follow-up audit identified, I think, a higher strategic risk, a gap that perhaps is not formally addressed, although those discussions have been going on when our senior management team meets with OSEG senior management team. But I think part of the solution, well, there are two things that we're going to do. We're going to better document the discussions we have on the Lansdowne operational risk so that it's more transparent in terms of the discussions we have. And then the second thing is to add to the agenda of, you know, the stakeholder agenda, the partner agendas, a specific formalized discussion of the higher strategic financial risk for the overall partnership. Those are two things that have never stood out as standalone items specifically, and those were management's response to that we recognize that a bit of work has to be done.
Okay, that's very, very helpful. Thank you for that. I'm glad that that is being recognized now. You know, on the whole, with terms of the city, that this report does speak to P3s. It lays it out in very stark detail, which is why I'm speaking to it. And, you know, for me, I used to work in risk management for 5 years. I did the Department of Justice first risk profile, and the evaluation of our risk at this city when it comes to P3s, in my view, hasn't been up to snuff. And it costs our residents when we don't do that upfront work or just pass it off to the private sector to handle when there's very different motives. This is one. This was the largest debt the city ever took on when we took on the Lansdowne contract. LRT 1 and 2 now are larger debts, but those are all P3s. And so we really have a lot on our hands in terms of the amount of debt we've taken on with P3. So we need to manage this in terms of our spending and our risk in a sustainable way, or it costs our residents. And so this is one where the report starts to get to the heart of that. So I appreciate the AG's work and your office's work on that. Chair, I appreciate your diligence today. Thanks for allowing these questions, and staff, I want to work with you on the Lansdowne piece as we move forward to continue that strong relationship, but to make sure that we've got, you know, our risks are taken into consideration and managed appropriately. I'll leave it there. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Menard. Just to note, I'm receiving notes from members who have commitments at 12:15 and at 12:30. I'm just pointing that out. And we want to maintain quorum, of course. In the absence of other questions, back to the Office of the Auditor General. with the Giver 150 follow-up.
Thank you, Chair. If I can get the slide up, that would be great.
Here we go.
Perfect. As you can see, there's not as much to report on this one. So in February of this year, we followed up on the recommendations that we made in the 2017 investigation into the Giver 150 playground at Mooney's Bay Park. Now, it's important to remember that the original audit found that the city had not breached any bylaws, policies, or other applicable requirements, but rather what we found is that it lacked a clear intake and evaluation mechanism for a project of this nature and breadth. So we made 3 recommendations and all of them were implemented. First, the city reminded its employees about their responsibility to ensure proper documentation, including in high-profile situations like this. Second, the orientation training for new managers now includes guidance that staff must formally consider and assess enhanced accountability and transparency mechanisms in potentially high-profile situations. So that, you know, should they hold public consultations and things like that. And lastly, public engagement training is available to staff, and we noted it has been taken by I think it's some 44 employees in 2017 and 2018. And given that it's not applicable to a large number of staff, we were happy to see that, and we considered the implementation to be completed. Any questions on this, Mr. Chair?
I am not seeing any questions. Members, last chance questions on this? No, I have just one, and it's a little bit odd. Quickly looked at this, saw the summary, 3 complete, 100%, all good, until I looked a little bit closer. And in a topsy-turvy world, recommendation number 2, your office is considering it complete, but management is considering it only partially complete. The oddest of situations. Can somebody tell me why this difference, and what further work management is going to do?
I think I can explain that, Chair. I don't think we were being overly generous in this case. It's just a matter that when we asked management to prepare their updates, they give us the information, and then by the time we got back to it, they'd actually introduced the training sessions, and they'd actually taken place. So we were able to give that a completed assessment. And so management was correct at its time, and I believe we were at ours. So it's a timing difference.
Noted. The good old accounting timing difference. I like it. Thank you. In the absence of any further questions, the last of the 6 today, very important audit follow-up, the emergency shelter audit. Over to you, Office of the Auditor General.
Okay, thank you. So in February of this year, we followed up on the recommendations that we'd made in the 2017 review of the management of the emergency shelter providers, the contract management aspects. The follow-up found that 2 of the 5 recommendations had been implemented, and 3 recommendations were partially implemented. The first partially implemented recommendation relates to the city's emergency shelter standards. And these standards provide the shelter operators with the framework for delivering the service to an acceptable level. And our follow-up found that while the 2005 standards, the updates have been made to the 2005 standards, they've been drafted, they haven't been discussed with the community, and they haven't been approved by committee and council. Second, we found that the development of a client satisfaction survey process was only partially complete. And lastly, the responsibility of shelter operators to assess the financial needs of emergency shelter clients in intake processes. We found that it had been clarified. However, these intake activities are not yet part of the city's inspection process. So in other words, the cities has told the shelters what we expect them to do. However, what we found is that they hadn't yet put a process in place to ensure that they do that. So, Mr. Chair, are there any questions related to this follow-up? Happy to take.
I am looking at the list. Anyone have any questions on the shelter?
Mr. Chair, this is Councilor Daruz. I do have a few questions.
Okay, thank you, Councillor DeRuz. I'll just remind other members to raise their hands, but Councillor DeRuz, over to you, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick question. City staff still going to the shelters to conduct inspection during COVID and during this pandemic?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So city staff will be attending at the shelters to make sure that our annual inspection processes are undertaken.
Thank you, Shelley. I have another question. I'm just wondering, there is only fully implementing 2 recommendations out of the 5. It's pretty low percentage, 40%, and I think this will present very low percentage on that one. Is the staff worried that the area that we aren't taking care of it, will this recommendation will be seriously impacting our services?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this was a very extensive review of our management of emergency shelter contracts, and we have completed, there's a number of sub recommendations under each item, and we have completed 12 of the 15 sub recommendations. The outstanding pieces are the actual standards themselves. We do have draft standards that have been, well, they've been drafted. We've consulted with the community, and really the delay was, we had aligned it originally to come with the 10-year housing and homelessness plan to CPSC in March of this year. And when our legislative processes were stopped due to COVID, we subsequently did bring the 10-year plan in June. However, because of the situation we now find ourselves in with COVID, we felt that though we had a complete, the draft standards were complete, we didn't need to go back out and do some further consultation around some of the elements of COVID that may be impacting the standards that we then put forward in Q1 of next year, specifically, around pieces about, food services, cleaning, bed separation, appropriate washroom and dining facilities. So the full standards and the inspection tools that align with the standards will be at CPSC in Q1 of 2021.
Thank you. That's very great answer. And my question probably will be with the Auditor General Office and probably staff is COVID and the pandemic. Is it going to delay a lot of these implementation? I'm assuming, to use a common sense, I'm assuming some of this recommendation is going to be pushed back and delayed. And do we know if we have a time frame, or are we prepared for that?
Mr. Chair, I don't know if they were looking for the Auditor General to respond. We feel confident that we can meet the timelines that we indicated in our management responses. Certainly when we look at how COVID is impacting our shelters and the requirements to look at the revised or updated shelter standards through that lens, there is some work to do there, definitely, but we're very confident that we will meet our timelines to get it before committee and council.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the answer. Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's all what I have.
Thank you, Councillor DeRuz. Councillor Kavanaugh, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. And thank you for the report. Of course, this is something that's quite crucial to us right now. And we want to make sure everything is up to date and in terms of our standards. You're talking about a report coming in the first quarter of 2021. Is this going to be an update on standards? Is this something that's going to be a recommendation to council to update?
That is correct. Through the audit, we're still operating under our 2005 emergency shelter standards. So there are standards that the shelter providers are still abiding by, or still have to follow the expectations and requirements of those standards. But through the audit, the Auditor General identified that our standards were out of date. They didn't reflect the changes in the shelter environment. So we have consulted and we have refreshed those standards and we have updated them. So that is the report that we will bring in 2021. Is those refreshed standards for council approval.
Can you give us an example of a standard that's that needs updating in terms of, well, obviously COVID is interfering with everything, but and another question to add on to that is in terms of are we keeping stats on terms of who's using our shelter, and is that going to be updated as well in terms of accurate information of you know, in terms of the kind of people that are there, because we need to see who is using our shelters in terms of, you know, because it tends to be overrepresented by certain minorities. And I think that people need to see that information as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So in response to the councillor's question, we do keep track of all the individuals who utilize an emergency shelter in Ottawa. We use a database called HIFIS. It's the Homeless Individuals and Family Information Center system. Sorry. So we are collecting data nightly on who's in the emergency shelter and demographics about those individuals. So in looking at the 2005 shelter standards, we actually have 45 new say standards that we've incorporated. We've also enhanced 35 other standards in the original standards document, and we've updated 9 additional standards with current policies. So they're reflective of guidelines and procedures we have in place, but may not have been incorporated into the standards. So for instance, an example would be weapons. As an example, you know, in the past, we didn't have a policy that specifically referenced, you know, weapons and, you know, what weapons were, well, all weapons are prohibited, obviously, but so that's an example. More robust pest control standards, more robust maintenance standards.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Kavanagh. Councillor Hoogly, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to ask a question on page 12. It talks about the update that you were saying is coming to council in early in the new year on the systems. It says on page 12 that not all the clients are using the same system. Is that going to get corrected?
So all of our emergency shelter providers all use the HIFIS system that I mentioned previously. So everybody uses that system to track who comes in and who utilizes a bed in the facility. And
they answer the same questions, like you're getting the same picture of each client? Is it okay?
Yes, definitely, Mr. Chair. We have a protocol about what data has to be collected when somebody comes into an emergency shelter and books a bed.
Okay, and my last piece is on the financial controls. Do you have any updated information on that? Because this is another example of vulnerable clients that we just don't have enough money to do all that we want to do there. So it's so critical that we pay attention to the money that we do have and make sure it's well spent. So is there additional efforts being made here on the recommendations with respect to financial controls?
Mr. Chair, so the audit did indicate that shelters were receiving the correct payments for the individuals that were in the beds. So that was in place. I believe the comment around financial controls was specific to some use of beds where there might have been a double billing. So we have rectified that and stopped that practice.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Any other questions from members? No? Seeing none. Ms. Vadenbuskirk.
Mr. Chair, if I may, just a quick question. I just thought about it.
Certainly, I apologize.
No, that's okay. I didn't put my hand up. Question to perhaps to the auditor. I know he didn't. It wasn't part of the audit, making sure we have submit all our expenses to the province with the cost of additional of hotel, and we know we spent quite a bit in the past. But have we keep a record of all the additional expenses coming because of COVID or other? Like, is that all been taken care of? Even if it's not part of this, but are we taking care of that?
It's an important question, Mr. Councillor Shantiri, if you have but it doesn't relate to the audit.
No, I said that earlier. Apologize.
Do you have a quick answer, Ms. Van Buskirk?
I do. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So to the councillor's question, absolutely, we keep track of all of our shelter costs. And separate from COVID, we are absolutely tracking all of our costs related to COVID and having to provide, the isolation and the physical distancing spaces that we require. And to date, we've received money from the provincial government and the federal government to cover the expenses associated with that portion of our COVID response.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the indulgement, Mr. Chair. I know it's not part of the audit, but I just want to make sure we are covering our bases. Thank you.
Vital element of the services we provide. Vice Chair Meehan, please.
Thank you, Chair. It was just, I was wondering if we are done with that portion. I was hoping to just ask a question of the Auditor General and perhaps the City Manager before we go on. So I'll let you continue the process though until that point.
Okay, thank you. We will be able to wrap up and provide overall feedback. Ms. Van Buskirk, just to complete this portion, thank you very much for all your work in the past couple of, since March and always. In my ward, the Jim Durrell Dempsey Community Center and the extraordinary efforts of your team in providing services. Let me just point out with respect to this audit, the original recommendations, and I appreciate that things have changed with COVID. The original recommendation, number 1, which is partially complete, the commitment was Q1 2019. Recommendation number 3, one of the elements, Q2 2019. Recommendation number 4, partially complete. The original recommendation was Q2 2018. And I guess my point is audits are important, and the recommendations to move forward to improve our services, our performance is important because we want to be ready for situations like the extraordinary pandemic that we're in. I don't require, you've done an outstanding job, but for you and for all our other staff, general managers, audits are important, and we see one of the reasons why they're important. It sets us up for success when things go off, when things change, so that we could provide services to the residents that count on it, and shelters is a vital part. So thank you for your service, and take that and get these recommendations implemented.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
That is Mr. Auditor General, you have no other presentations, elements of the presentation. Is that correct?
Oui, c'est correct, Monsieur le Président, mais je veux dire des petites choses en sommaire. Just have a few words of conclusion, perhaps. So, Monsieur le Président, les suivis sont un pratique exemplaire. Et c'est clair que la direction a accompli des progrès, mais la direction doit viser sur la mise en œuvre des recommandations. Audit follow-ups are best practice that are followed by audit groups around the world. It's an important part of the audit process, and it ensures that the organization gets the value from the audit investment that they've made, both the investment from the audit shop as well as the investment from staff time. But with 58% of the recommendations complete since receiving these audits in 2015, 2016, and 2017, management must concentrate on implementing the recommendations as they promised to council, and they must do so on a more timely basis. I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the cooperation that we received from the staff as we conducted our follow-ups, and I also thank the staff of my office for the good work that they did. And c'est ça, c'est tout, Monsieur le Président, that's it. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Auditor General, and yes, thank you to you and your colleagues that have presented here today, and to the other staff that are in your office who are not here, but who do the important and difficult work of audits and follow-ups. There's been a general theme today with respect to the recommendations that have not been implemented. And the respect of those recommendations and the importance of those recommendations. I think we saw on one of your original slides, in your presentation, Mr. Auditor General, a decline in the recommendations, in the implementation of those recommendations. And I think that's something that we need to correct. And I've spoken to that as part of several of the audits that we've seen today. Sometimes the city management has those reports for 9 or 10 months, and still recommendations have not been implemented. We want to ensure that taxpayers get value from staff, from the Office of the Auditor General. And you talked about, Mr. Auditor General, about the investment that we do in the Office of the Auditor General. It's not just an expense, it's an investment so that we can do better. And I made that point specifically with Ms. Van Buskirk, shelters, but childcare is an important element. Markets drive tourism. Lansdowne Park is an important infrastructure. Giver 150 is recreational aspect. All of those are important to our city and to those who visit our city. And I think that together we can do better at implementing those recommendations. Vice Chair Meehan, I think would you like to comment and perhaps put forward a motion?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I would. But I just want to reiterate, I think what the Auditor General is telling us is the decrease in the implementation rate of the recommendations has fallen from 80 to 60%. Mr. Auditor General, how concerned should we be with that?
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. I think as an organization, whether we're talking about a manager or whether we're talking about a council or even a taxpayer, we should be concerned because of that investment that I spoke about earlier. But more importantly, I have no doubt, I've been at the city for a while, you know that, and I've spoken to many of the city's 17,000 employees, and there's no doubt that most of the city's employees go to work every day to do the best that they can to deliver the best service that they can to the taxpayers of the city of Ottawa. Audits and the recommendations and the promises that management makes to implement them ensure that they add to that delivery of the best service that they can to the taxpayer. So when I see 58% of the recommendations being implemented after this length of time, beyond the time that was committed by management, I am concerned, and I think that as an organization we owe it to the taxpayers to pay more attention to the implementation of these recommendations and improve that record.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for reiterating that. I'm just wondering if I can direct a question to our city manager. Is Steve still there?
Yes, Chair, I'm still here. Thank you.
Mr. Kanellakis, how concerned are you with the decrease in the implementation rate?
Well, Chair, the comment, first of all, let's say that, the Auditor General is in his last few months as our Auditor General, and I think he's done an amazing job during his tenure looking at things that have really helped management of the city improve the way we operate. And he's been very prolific at making recommendations. There's a lot of recommendations he's given us, and I'm proud to say that we've been very good at implementing them. Just for context, since 2005, we've been tracking audit recommendations that have come through the Auditor General, Mr. Hughes and his predecessor. And we've had since 2005, 2,416 recommendations that have been made to city management on the various audits. And I'm proud to say that 96% of all those recommendations have been completely implemented. You're seeing a little bit of a trend here now in the last few audits, last several years, where there's been some that haven't been implemented, as you talked about today. You've heard some reasons and explanations why they're not. Can we get better? Absolutely. But I also like to bring council back, and anyone listening back, to the context that 96% completion rate on over 2,400 recommendations is a demonstration that staff are committed to implement the recommendations. I think sometimes we're a little too aggressive and optimistic in the dates we put in the management responses, but when we can implement them, sometimes things happen that push us off, and sometimes we drop the ball. I'll acknowledge that happens. But overall, I don't want to come to the conclusion. I can't come to the conclusion. I hope that audit committee does and council does, that staff aren't diligent in terms of implementing the recommendations. Our track record speaks for itself. We will continue to pursue the ones that are outstanding to make sure they're implemented. And I understand that the vice chair has a motion that will help us do that. And I'm fully supportive of the motion as I've seen it this morning. I think that's a good move for us to have the conversations we need to have and be able to get proper explanation from the staff that are working on it for the chair and vice chair, and to be able to bring back to audit committee any concerns the chair and vice chair might have. So we are supportive of the next steps to do that, to ensure that we are continuously improving, that we do better. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I acknowledge your comments there, Mr. Kanalakis, but 40% of them haven't been implemented. Excuse me. And when you say we dropped the ball, I think the motion that I would like to support today is going to address that and hopefully keep the recommendations top of mind so that that doesn't happen, because the taxpayers are reliant on us for that. So excuse me, it's not COVID, it's just a tickle. With that, I'd like to read the recommendation I'm putting forward today on behalf of the chair. Is that the timing of that, Mr. Chair, would be okay?
The timing is fine. I'll just point out it's not a recommendation. It is a motion by this.
It is a motion. Yes. Whereas management is committed to ensuring the timely implementation of audit recommendations, and whereas follow-up is a key component of an effective audit process in that it informs council as to whether recommendations have been implemented, whereas there are instances where time lags to implementation can occur given the nature of the audit recommendation due to factors such as evolving statutory requirements, evolving technology, and implementations on procurement and budget-driven considerations, changes to existing collective agreements to enable implementation, etc. Therefore, be it resolved that a working group be established that would include the audit committee chair, vice chair, the auditor general, and city manager to monitor the status of implementation of council-approved audit recommendations, and provide a forum to discuss audit recommendations where circumstances may have changed that impact implementation. And therefore be it resolved that the working group would have the following mandate: review the audit status tracking report as required to ensure that staff have implemented the approved audit recommendations, submit quarterly a status report to audit committee and council for information, approve the work plan for resolving recommendations under dispute, receive additional background information on disputed items from both staff and the Auditor General when there is a disagreement between the two parties, formulate recommendations in terms of direction to staff for directions by the Audit Committee and Council on the disputed item, receive background information when the recommendation has been deemed no longer applicable since the audit recommendations were approved. Example, staff cannot implement the recommendation or a change in resources is required to implement, and also direct staff on next steps. And finally, undertake any additional or ad hoc work or oversight role as directed by the Audit Committee and City Council. Could I ask what the Auditor General thinks of this motion?
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair, Mr. Chair. I think the intent of the of the motion is important. I think there are some activities that would fall under the mandate of the working group that are already incorporated in our follow-up process. For example, As you saw in some of the recommendations that we provided, some of the reports that we provided to you earlier, when we find that circumstances have changed and a recommendation is no longer applicable, we say so and we report on it. I don't think that's something that would necessarily come up in the it's necessary to be handled by the committee. That's already addressed. I think in my time there has not been a single disagree between staff and this office. So having that covered by the committee would be covered by the working group would be of benefit should they arise. I just haven't seen any arise in my time, and I don't remember even in a couple of years prior to me where there were disagreements. But more importantly, I do not know of a single audit committee that I'm aware of where an audit recommendation status report isn't provided directly to the audit committee. This is the only one I'm aware of, and I don't having that report go to a working group. I would certainly participate in that working group. It's important work to be done. I don't understand why there is resistance to submit for information purposes only to audit committee the implementation status on recommendations. Every other audit committee in the world does so. It's a best practice identified by all of those organizations that work in the field of audit. Here in Ottawa, we've got the Canadian Auditing Accountability Foundation. It's a best practice that they recommend. So I am supportive of it, of the motion. I would suggest that you could probably implement a best practice where the status report is provided for information purposes to audit committee. I think that would be of benefit, but certainly I would be prepared to be part of that working group. But I think you could make it stronger if you also provided that information for information purposes only to audit committee.
Okay. Jean, this is your motion. Do you want to respond? I agree with the Auditor General. I think this is making more work for us, and I would like to see something a little bit simpler and more direct, and just as a reminder to staff that what has to be done.
I thought this was your motion, Vice Chair, but if you are not supportive of it, that's fine. I will move the motion. The tracking to provide a tracking report as required and to submit a quarterly status report to the audit committee and to council for information, I think are important parts of this motion, and I am fully supportive of that. I just want to point out and just get the concurrence of the Auditor General that this working group does not substitute for audit follow-ups. The working group precedes the audit follow-ups. We as a working group cannot do the work of the Office of the Auditor General, and a follow-up is a vital part of any audit. Is that correct? You would still do audit follow-ups?
Absolutely. As I indicated, Mr. Chair, follow-ups are a best practice. Even in every other audit committee where they regularly receive these updates and follow up with management, that's a regular occurrence in pretty well every audit committee I'm aware of. The follow-ups are still done by the audit group because, as you saw, there are sometimes the self-assessment done by management sometimes differs from the assessment that is done by the auditors when they go in to do their follow-up. So yes, the follow-ups would still continue, but I would encourage submitting on a regular basis. If you're going to be providing that status report to the working group, my suggestion is you also provide that to audit committee, like every other audit committee in the world. But this is, as I said, this is the only audit committee that I'm aware of that doesn't provide the status report.
Mr. AG, I think over the years we've discussed that, the difficulty I think that your office has in undertaking new audits when you're continuing doing follow-up audits. Is that still the case? Is that still a concern for you? And what would this motion, if passed today, mean for your workload?
Well, that's a valid point. I mean, I think that audit is a limited resource. We've talked about that many times. In coming back to audit committee with follow-up reports in the past, and indeed in these follow-up reports, in some instances, I can think of 3 audits where we have 3 follow-ups, where we have rescheduled additional follow-ups, which is, in my mind, a waste of not just the first audit resource where the audit report was prepared, but then a waste of the audit resource to do the follow-up. When we did that for the audit report for ethics, we already did a follow-up report on ethics, but the implementation wasn't significant, and we felt that it was so important that we should go back. So we did a follow-up again on those recommendations. On the Lansdowne report today, we did our follow-up on the management of the Lansdowne contract. We did our follow-up, and we've identified 3 more recommendations that we will follow up going forward. So yes, everything that we can implement to improve the implementation, the timely implementation of recommendations is important. And I think providing on a regular basis for information purposes only to the audit committee a status of audit recommendation implementation, which every other audit committee in the world does, I think that would add additional pressure, remind staff that those recommendations are out there, that their promises are out there, and that they've got to move towards implementation.
Well, I tend to agree, because that was my intent. I was hoping to see something very simple, just a quarterly report from management to city manager to us, to the committee, to remind us that these are the recommendations. Just, are they started? Are they complete? Partially complete? That's all we need to do. Keeps it top of mind for us at the committee. Means nothing, no more work for the Auditor General and his team. And there's nothing wrong with the way we do things. We just need a reminder to staff of what has to be done. And I think I understand the intent of this motion today, but I would like to see it a lot simpler. That's it for me.
Vice Chair, Councillor Hubley, I see your hand up. Thank you. Vice Chair Meehan, we exchanged. Are you moving this motion?
I think I'll take it off the.
Just straight up, yes or no? Are you moving this motion?
She's muted herself.
Is that a yes or no? I can't hear her. You are muted, Vice Chair.
I'm pressing the unmuted button. Is it not working?
It's working now.
That's working now. I will take this off the table. I will not support it.
Thank you. I am moving the motion that the Vice Chair has read. And thank you. Councillor Hubley, on the motion that is on the table, do you, first of all, Mr. O'Connor, I believe you are on. Do you have any comments about this motion? Are you on? There you are. You are muted, Mr. O'Connor.
I think I'm unmuted now, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. I appreciate it. I didn't get a chance to see this motion before it just went live, so I apologize for the interjection. I can advise council that under Section 238 of the Municipal Act, it would appear from my first reading of this motion that this could in fact be an official subcommittee. Appreciate you called it a working group, but the legislation speaks to or a similar entity, so it's very, very broad. So it might be the fact that if you go ahead with this motion, that it would be in fact a subcommittee, which would of course then require a committee coordinator, notice under our notice bylaw, procedural bylaw, people getting together in a meeting, public discussion, a report being drafted, an agenda being drafted. So all of that to say, I'm not certain that was the intent as I followed along in the discussion, and I took the Vice Chair's comments very seriously. She didn't want to add to the workload at this point. It was just something to update So, Mr. Chair, I'm willing to take this offline and before council to revisit this and maybe have a discussion with you and the vice chair and see if we can't come to an amicable and I think procedurally correct resolution.
You're muted, Sean.
Thank you. That does not preclude if it's the committee's will to pass this motion today.
No, Mr. Chair, it does not.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Councillor Hubley on the motion that I am moving.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think we need to listen to the clerk's advice here, and I'll say why. The idea of follow-ups to audits was something that you and I actually worked on in the last term of council, because they used to be just part of the audit annual report. And we worked with the Auditor General to make it a separate reporting to the committee so that there was more importance put on the follow-ups by city staff. I think we had a lot of progress with that. I'm hoping the AG would agree there. My concern here is that the AG is telling us no one else does this. And the purpose of doing the follow-ups in the audit committee is so that the public realizes that we're paying attention to areas that the AG has said that tax dollars could be at risk. And we're not just issuing a report about it, we're actually following up and saying, are the recommendations being implemented? So I'm going to encourage you as someone I respect a lot, and I think you're doing a great job as the chair this term. I would ask you to take a moment and consider the clerk's advice and maybe take this offline without a vote at this time. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Hubley. Your advice is appreciated. Councillor Kavanagh on this motion.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I'm going to agree with my colleague, Councillor Hubley. I think it would be a good idea to take this offline and think this over. I think we're rushing into it, and a little concerned that it doesn't feel that it's a public meeting. And it's very important that that what we do is in public. And I think that if I'm listening to our Auditor General, I'm listening to our clerk, and I think that there's very important information from their collective institutional knowledge on this. And I think we all want the right thing, Chair. I think we all want the public to feel that things are getting looked into, and your heart's in the right place. But I think we need to look at this again.
Thank you.
Get more public.
Thank you, Councillor Kavanagh. I appreciate that very much. Did anyone else want to speak on the motion?
Wasn't ready.
Okay. Well, considering the sage advice of the caution of the clerk with respect to governance, the sage advice of the Auditor General with respect to best practices, the Vice Chair's comments, and Councillor Hubley, Councillor Kavanagh, I want this to be a productive thing to make, not to add more work, but to assist in moving recommendations along. I am withdrawing the motion at this time, and I will take it offline with the clerk and with the Auditor General and with my colleagues on this committee to make sure that we are in concert with that when and if this comes back either at council or at a subsequent audit committee. So on that, I withdraw the motion. I don't need any, I just withdraw the motion, Carol, and that's done. Okay. Thank you very much. And so I think that concludes item number 1 of the Auditor General report on audit follow-ups, and the recommendation is that the audit committee receive the report on audit follow-ups and detailed audit follow-ups report and recommend that council consider and approve the report recommendations. Is that carried?
Carried.
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 Thank you. Any dissent? Seeing and hearing none. Moving on in the agenda, any in-camera items? I'm seeing none. Any notices of motion by any member? Thank you. Inquiries? Any other business? Motion to adjourn?
Carried.
Thank you. I believe there is a media availability. It will be 15 minutes after the end of this. So let's say at 12:50 in 15 minutes from now at 10 to 1 media availability. Thank you all. Thank you. And thank you for your report, Mr. Auditor General.